team together for this very like RFK-esque, JFK-esque speech. Very different. Guys, we need to drink more flaxseed oil and get rid of the fluoride in the water. And welcome back to another episode of Books Gone By. No, I'm just kidding. This is the Games Gone By podcast, and I'm your host, Adam. Joining me today, as always, Austin and Jeff. Are you guys ready to discuss books?
Is that what we're doing today? Oh, God.
I'm so impressed that you made me read an entire book for this show. Like, you should get, like, a Medal of Freedom or something.
I listened to a book for this show, but, you know, I'll count it.
Oh, boo.
We'll count that as close enough. So today, guys, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to discuss a book, although it is very related to video games because we're not that cultured. But it is the latest from Bloomberg's Jason Schrier, entitled Play Nice, The Rise, Fall, and Future of Blizzard Entertainment. It's a nice little expose about Blizzard Entertainment and kind of, not necessarily the industry at large, but it does intersect with a lot of the things you can talk about with the industry at large over the last 30 years. It's a really interesting book. Anyone listening, I definitely advocate that you just go get it and read it before listening to this, because it's kind of weird to say like spoilers in a nonfiction book that's just covering history, but the way that it is told is just so enthralling in my mind that I really do think you are better off hearing it for the first time from the man himself. But regardless, I want to start off by saying, what does Blizzard Entertainment mean to us? Jeff, why don't you start?
Yeah, so Blizzard is that storied PC gaming company that somehow managed to dominate like my favorite form of entertainment throughout the 90s and 2000s. Like, I am a huge RTS gamer, so if you talk to me about Blizzard, I'm thinking StarCraft all the time, Warcraft, and then I have a lot of mixed feelings about them. And their biggest title, their MMORPG World of Warcraft. So yeah, those are the things that come to mind for me. Austin, what do you think about Blizzard?
It's funny you say that, because my experience with Blizzard is almost completely different. I didn't really grow up playing a ton of PC games. I was more of a console gamer. And because of that, I didn't really get much into the RTS and like Warcraft, StarCraft. My earliest experience with Blizzard was playing Warcraft in my grandma's living room with Adam and his brother James on like 3 laptops playing like Dota. Like that's
true.
That's my first experience with Blizzard that I can recall, and that was about the extent of it until Overwatch came out, and then I played so much Overwatch. And that's really about it. I've then dabbled in Diablo, StarCraft, Warcraft, like later on. But up until Overwatch, I really hadn't played anything Blizzard-y at all.
The funniest thing to me about Blizzard is just, you know, with how many genres they've gotten into, I routinely forget that, like, Diablo is a Blizzard game.
Right.
And they continued making games after World of Warcraft. It's like, oh, right, remember that shooter, Overwatch? Yeah, that was also
Yeah, well, you and Blizzard executives too, apparently, because at one point in this book, one of the guys was like, I kept being told by executives that Diablo isn't a real Blizzard game.
Yes, there is a lot to be said about the different franchises and which was their favorite child over there at Blizzard headquarters. But to me, my mind will always be firmly rooted in the early 2000s and, you know, enacting Sarah Kerrigan's revenge on the galaxy.
Yeah, that StarCraft campaign is awesome, which is really where my first interaction with Blizzard happened. You know, I had played probably like Age of Empires by that point, so I was familiar with RTS, but I hadn't actually played StarCraft. And I remember there was a kid in my class named Richard who was obsessed with this game, and he wouldn't stop talking about it. And one day he just brings me both StarCraft and Brood War like on a burned CD, and I'm like, okay. So I go to play it. I'm terrible at the multiplayer. He like, dude, we have to play online. I hated it. I absolutely hated it. But I go to play the campaign, and the campaigns are just amazing in this game. Like the characters, you know, for the time, the voice acting, the artwork, great story. I was super enthralled by that, which of course later on I ended up playing Warcraft 3 and loved that for the same reasons. So I was really big on the story elements of these early games, which I think is a little disappointing that they never really made more Warcraft besides World of Warcraft, because the MMO is just the worst way to tell a story. But we'll get to that shortly.
Hey, quick sidebar. Your friend Richard Kim,
Yes.
right?
That was
the
him.
Korean. Okay, that
Yeah,
makes
I didn't
too
want to
much
bring that up,
sense.
but yeah, super Korean.
Sorry, I also knew Richard, and so you have unlocked a hidden memory of me. I did not realize that the country of South Korea is responsible for my RTS addiction, but
Yeah,
It
thanks,
does make
Korea.
sense, though. It does make sense.
yeah, their cultural prowess invaded like my sixth grade classroom. So, yeah, I guess that's really it for me. Is I ended up playing a ton of World of Warcraft, and then over the years, I went StarCraft 2 came out. I would check that out. I never got into any of the other games since Warcraft 3 and WoW nearly as much, but I think I have dabbled in all of them at this point. Even Hearthstone and Heroes of the Storm and all that. But to me, Blizzard is synonymous with the RTS era, and then of course like Warcraft. And speaking of Warcraft, that's a great place to start, is the founding of Blizzard Entertainment, right? Because Warcraft was their first game, and this was a tiny company founded out in Irvine, California, by Alan Adham, the son of Egyptian immigrants, and Mike Morhaime. They met in the computer lab, and there's a funny little story. They both went to UC Irvine, and they're in the computer lab next to each other, and Mike Morhaime tries to play a prank on Adam as he walks away by logging into his own account, and he's like, he's going to come back to type in his password, and he won't be able to get in because I've locked him out under mine. Adam hits a couple buttons, the computer unlocks. He's like, well, what the heck did you do? He's like, I just typed in my password. Turns out they both had the same password, Joe, Joe. Ridiculous. Bad network security. But
The finest in digital security, circa 1992.
Actually, an insane founding story, though. Like,
yeah, it really is. So Adam ends up convincing Morhaime to form this company with him. They bring over a advisor from Interplay named Brian Fargo. So Interplay Productions was doing a bunch of stuff at the time, right? I think they even end up being the ones that published The Lost Vikings, which is one of Blizzard's early games.
What a throwback.
Yeah, so they form this company, the three of them. They end up hiring Frank Pierce and Patrick Wyatt, who are like kind of founding Blizzard members, not actual founders, but very much like among the first employees. And, like a lot of small companies at the time, they're starting off by, what we call porting these various games to different systems, right? And that ends up being how they even meet, the Diablo guys, the Condors, because they're doing the same game. But this is how so many of these companies back then made money at the beginning. If you've ever played that game, Game Dev Tycoon, there's like the contracts you can do.
Oh man, great experience.
Fundamental to your company not going under in the early days before you get your first hit, right?
Yeah. You forget how like different the video game scene was in like the 1990s.
Yeah.
Before the internet, like long before anything like a live service game. All these companies are tiny. They're contract dudes. They're taking licensed IPs from other companies and just trying to churn out something that, does well enough to sell, physical copies. Like this is just a different era of gaming.
Yeah, so they are obsessed with a game called Dune 2 at the time. So while they're doing all these ports and stuff, they're of course playing games in the office as nerds who had their own company would do back in the day. And it's kind of considered the first RTS. And, in typical Blizzard fashion, this would kind of be the first instance of it. They just sat around all day talking about how could we make this game but better, right? And so Warcraft is born. There's a little bit of stuff in the book, and there's always been rumors about this. Like, was it almost a game workshop game? It really doesn't feel like it got very far. They kind of had some early discussions with it, but they thought, hey, well, we still like this whole idea, so we'll just turn them into kind of generic like monsters and elves and humans, right?
It's funny to go back and play these Blizzard RTSs, and it's like, if you ever read the story on the internet of like, StarCraft is just a clone of 40K or whatever, it's very easy to see why. Like these guys were clearly steeped in the same fantasy genres that were very popular in the 80s when they were growing up, 70s and 80s. And so I guess we shouldn't be surprised that their early games look just like that.
Yeah, the first game's subtitle is literally Orcs and Humans, right? Very, very basic. They end up making this Warcraft game, going at Dune 2. It was so similar that one of the executives over at Westwood Studios ends up saying, if imitation is the highest form of flattery, boy, were they flattering us. Like,
Westwood being the developer of Command and Conquer. Do I have that right?
yes, so I think after Dune 2, they would go on to be famous for the Command and Conquer franchise.
Oh, they also made the original Dune 2. Right, because this is what we're talking about, is them copying that. Okay.
another RTS that I actually have played. I've played Red Alert.
Oh, nice.
Just saying. Yep.
So that's where Patrick Wyatt, he's going to be a name that comes up a little bit today. He was an early programmer for them. He was the one that started the first bit of programming on Warcraft. He ends up being kind of like one of the principal programmers that's not Adam or Morhaime. So they switched names a couple times. They were Chaos Studios at one point because they liked the idea of the management by chaos is what they kept saying, right?
Plus, they're like, what, young dudes, and what's cooler than chaos,
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, it's like perfect, edgy, early 20s, like, Chaos Studios.
There's still games coming out today who talk, like, was it Final Fantasy 15 that was doing this? 16?
Oh, no, that's Final Fantasy Origins, or whatever.
Okay.
Like, Origin spin-off thing that was just, like, chaos all the time.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
Yeah.
So they end up eventually changing that to Blizzard because I think Chaos was already taken by something. And they're like, oh, what's something else that embodies that madness? And they're like, a Blizzard, right? So they end up making that. They make Warcraft 2. Obviously, they're going to make a sequel. It comes out. Warcraft 2 is super popular. They get involved with the whole Blizzard North thing, which we'll get to later, and they make StarCraft. And all of this leads them to they're working on Warcraft 3. And this is where the story of World of Warcraft really starts. Is during the development of Warcraft 3, everyone is addicted to EverQuest and Ultima Online. So you have the guys up at Blizzard North, David Brevik, is like shouting down the hallways about UO all the time. You have Alan Adam is totally obsessed with EverQuest, and he's always talking about it. You'd have guys later, Jeffrey Kaplan was notorious for this huge rant he went on the EverQuest forums about their terrible systems. That's actually like part of the lore of what got him hired, right? They really liked just everything he specifically complained about with EverQuest. So these guys are just super addicted to this, and it kind of starts with a employee named Kevin Beardsley. He just starts keeping a log, and he's like, what about this game pisses me off, right? So, there was the esoteric, like, quest design. You had to kind of speak to the NPCs and type in, like, keywords to get them to say the right thing, and then only then would you finally get the quest. There's no quest log, so you're just, like, writing these in a notebook. All the unpopular zones are empty because everyone wants to go to the most, like, efficient ones. But the thing he thought was the dumbest was that you would have these big world bosses and you'd get these huge raids of 50, 60 players. They'd kill it, and then it just didn't come back until the monthly server reset, which was kind of ridiculous, right? And what he writes down and what is quoted in the book is, who would go to Disneyland if a ride closed after the first group wrote it?
No one at all. But, it's important, right? You got to put in the time sink and earn the right for you to have fun. Yeah, that's like the take I feel like a lot of these early RPGs and even early MMOs kind of had, is that like in order to keep gamers hooked in, like there had to be sacrifices made, right? Like you had to be all the way into the game and willing to put in the time. And as you read the book and you read about all of Blizzard's franchises, that just like wasn't their thing. They were not developers who wanted you to have to sit there and like have a bad experience in order to maybe later have fun. They wanted you to have fun all the time, which is probably one of the reasons they've made so many smash hit titles.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where, at the time, you don't have a lot of games you can play, and you're probably, especially if you're a kid, you're like buying one every few months, and you do want it to last. And I don't think all of that was just like artificial time inflation, but some of it probably was, especially I was playing one of the early Ultima games the other day, and I was just like, good Lord, some of the things they make you do for the simplest of progressions, because you were going to play it 6 hours after school every day because you were 12.
Yeah.
And that's what you did. Like,
yeah. Someone is going to hear me talk about how, Blizzard tried to make World of Warcraft be fun all the time to play, except that's literally where they learned the term grinding from. They're gonna be like, what are you talking about? I've had so many boring experiences grinding up to level 60, blah blah blah. And that's just because Blizzard is one of those few companies that have spanned like multiple eras of gaming. And the reason we're talking about like the elephant in the room, World of Warcraft, so early in the episode is because that's what 90% of you are going to know them for, right?
Yeah.
It was funny, Adam, when you were like, oh, everyone was addicted to like EverQuest and Ultima Online. But you got to remember, everyone was like, the small niche gaming community, right? The handful of people.
Everyone who knew what an MMO was at the time, which, was not very many people.
Correct. Which was not like every third person on the street. Meanwhile, World of Warcraft is the kind of title that spawned cultural phenomenons that, get interviews on like daytime talk shows because he once shouted Leroy Jenkins really loud into a microphone. So.
Well, I mean, I had relatives and friends who didn't play games really much at all, except for World of Warcraft. Like, they weren't big gaming people. They didn't have a console or a PC that they played games on regularly until World of Warcraft came out. And that was what was like, I play WoW, and it's like, what else do you play? Like, nothing. I just play WoW.
Yeah.
Like, and that was, for me, as someone who didn't really get into MMOs at the time, or didn't really understand the appeal of them, like, that was shocking to me. I was like, wow, you only play one game. It's just WoW. Okay. Interesting.
Jeff and I had a mutual acquaintance who will remain nameless, who shamed us constantly through high school for playing World of Warcraft. Just every opportunity she got. And then it would turn out that sometime in college she got addicted and has raided every single expansion since, started her own guild, met friends on it. Like, it truly did turn people who'd never really played games into like total addicts. I mean, it really was powerful.
This is one of the reasons you should read the book, is that it's super interesting to read about kind of how a cultural phenomenon like that came to be. Like, so few things like just break through to like hit true mainstream popularity, that getting a nice behind the scenes look of like, well, how did that actually happen, is really entertaining, even if you're just in it for like the dumb stories of, you know, like corporate fights or corporate espionage, what have you. Reading about the making of World of Warcraft was a lot of fun.
It really did require everything to go right at the same time. And one of those things really was, so Adam had gotten kind of burned out after Warcraft 2, and he took one of his like 4 sabbaticals mentioned in this book. But he comes back from the first one because a group of employees pitch World of Warcraft to Morhaime, and Morhaime kind of tells Adam about it. And Adam's like, holy shit, this is awesome. Like, he immediately comes back to work, right? And it was kind of funny because in the early days, people kind of considered it like his pet project. And a lot of employees even felt like, this is going to be a failed experiment. We're taking all these people off Warcraft 3 that really should be working on Warcraft 3. Like, why are we doing this?
Yeah, and it's just such an interesting... I alluded to this earlier, like, Blizzard did not seem like the company you would bet on to make the MMO that would dominate the world, right?
Right.
You know, you would expect someone like Sony Online Entertainment, who has lots of experience making EverQuest, who literally just launched a Star Wars MMO to be the one that, you know, brings MMOs to the mainstream, and they did not. They failed. And that's just because it was the wrong people, not necessarily at the wrong time, but it was the wrong people doing the wrong things, while Blizzard had the right kind of people doing the right things that were interested in, you know, building something that they wanted to play. Now, you can give them a little bit, or you can hate on them a little bit for being like, well, it is easier to like enter a market after someone's done it poorly, right? After you've spent hundreds of hours seeing like how to make mistakes on something. But to actually like bring a crew together and iterate on something and do it correctly is just not something you see a lot of companies do. Usually once a market kind of matures, you see a lot of like copycat stuff or things that are just cheaper or getting worse, which that's certainly a thing. Go check out the Chinese gaming market anytime. But it's really impressive to see a company like Blizzard without particular experience in something like an MMO turn around and shift their company to produce the most popular MMO title ever. I don't think it's ever going to be dethroned from that. Will it?
Probably not. I mean, at one point in the book, John Statz, who is one of the Warcraft directors, jokes that after Classic launch, they now have the 2 largest MMOs in the world.
Oh, right. Yeah, we haven't even gotten far enough to talk about how they rebooted it. They're just releasing the whole thing again.
It's not only that, but they're also doing something now called Remix, which is a limited time event where you play through an expansion with a brand new character, and everything is kind of accelerated. So it's like every month they unlock the next raid, and you can kind of unlock new equipment that carries over to new characters. So the idea is that like you blow through it with one, and you can spend all this time warp currency on all the gear from back then without having to necessarily do all of those instances and dungeons. Although you can and get even like the better gear from it. But it's pretty cool. But it is just funny to me that now at this point, like, there are so many iterations of re-Warcrafting their universe.
That is funny. It might be something for me. I'm that WoW player that, again, this like dominated the internet culture of my teenage years, but I didn't hit max level until the next expansion at any time. I have vivid memories of being like, Jeff, why aren't you level 60 yet? And I'm like,
We need a tank, man. We need fighters.
Something I found interesting when talking about like the creation of Blizzard, and Jeff, you had mentioned like Blizzard's not the company you necessarily would have bet on to do this. The Vivendi executives did place all of their bets on Blizzard for this MMO. I mean, they had two other MMOs in production with Lord of the Rings and their Marvel MMOs that they were working on, and they were like, you know what? Blizzard seem like the guys that are going to do this. Like, you know, taking stats and you know, analysis of the market and everything. It's not like they just, you know, threw a dart at a dartboard, but
Right.
doing the analysis, they're like, no, Blizzard seems like the guys, and then kind of went all in on WoW to be this huge thing. And like, that's a pretty big risk for this company at this time.
French utilities company.
yeah, there you go. Since you brought it up, Austin, to just to give you a peek into why you should read the book and find out about these corporate stories that like you're not going to know about. It is nonfiction, like Adam said, but Adam's right. There's like kind of spoilers in there. Who knew that a French utilities company was responsible for World of Warcraft, right? Their capital
Right, like,
was
what
funding
a
the company.
fascinating concept.
And of course, that's only after Blizzard's purchased by the people who made Math Blaster. So there's truly a real like story there to their various acquisitions.
That reference was absolutely nuts to me. As a child of the 90s who played entirely too much Math Blaster, I had no idea that like the single set of nerds in California would like create so many of my entertainment hours for me.
When I tell people what I do now, I always say like, "Oh, I do like education software," and then I say, "But it's not like Math Blaster."
Right.
I want to make it clear I'm not making fun ass games, but
I'm making like boring like interfaces for parents to look at their kids' grades, but
So getting back to the kind of development of this, you know, there's a guy that comes in named David Ray, and he's a programmer, and he ends up making these really solid tools that I think they still use some iteration of today called WoW Edit. And this basically allows people to, the quest designers and the level designers, to make all of that content without knowing, you know, exactly how to do all the hardcore programming. And he kind of got a nickname Dr. No, because the artist would always be coming to him like, can it do this? And he's like, listen, we need this to be a lean machine that can do a very small set of things, and you need to learn how to do them well. And I'm not going to waste all of this time putting in as many features as possible. I want to make sure the features we put in are like solid. And I think that was a good direction for them to take.
Honestly, that's such great advice for building literally anything, or honestly doing any kind of project in your life. Keep it simple, folks. Do a few things really well, and then find out other ways to accomplish other goals of yours. The number of projects, software or otherwise, that I've seen just die because people say yes too often. Yeah, I don't know. It is corny corporate advice, but learn to say no, folks. It is good for you.
So there's actually another book that I'll just bring into discussion real quick. It's called The WoW Diary, and it was just a kind of this guy kept a diary during his name was John Stat. No, was it John Stats? I think so. He's one of the designers. I may have said John Stats earlier, and I definitely meant John Haidt. He was the director. So, but John Stats was this designer, and he kept a little diary, and he ends up releasing it with a bunch of pictures and stuff. It's like this cool book. But one of the things he talks about, so one of the engineers spent a while coming up with this really, really cool system for the water, and the way like the physics would behave realistic, and it would jostle all around when people walk through it. It was really cool. And then they go and put it in the game, and the frame rate just drops to zero, like immediately, right? So that was one of the things that they really learn as they're doing this is like, we can't make this the same way we did our single player games. We have to account for the fact that like these are going to be huge worlds with tons of people in them, and and that's really such a core part of their like artistic style is they weren't going for realistic. They were going for what looks timeless and can run on people's potato machines.
Yeah, 100%. And it's just, you know, like it points at how World of Warcraft is just a very different beast from other kinds of video games. And again, it emphasizes like, oh, you wouldn't have expected Blizzard to have like built this game because they made RTSs before. But, you know, if you do think about it a little bit, Blizzard was really into writing in-depth, interesting stories for these RTS games. Something that, you know, playing their titles as a kid, I grew accustomed to, and then suddenly no one else does that. And I'm like, what's going on? I thought RTSs were story-driven. What the hell? But they were really into story-driven design. And then like one of the big features of their early RTSs was the multiplayer. Like what they loved so much about building Warcraft was being able to fight each other, a feature that was missing from other early RTSs. And then so when you look at that, like they really like making polished games. They have experience building these sort of networked games with multiplayer, and they're really into writing. Suddenly you can kind of see some of the shape of the foundation of World of Warcraft being there. And it's just really impressive that like both the guys themselves and management were like, yeah, we can do this. Let's go do this.
And so, World of Warcraft, like a lot of their games, would end up involving a lot of crunch, which I think was just really common in those early days because you had so little structure in reining in ideas that your vision would just grow and grow and grow. And suddenly you're 6 months out from the first deadline. You're like, oh my God, everyone, all hands, especially, so many
we
young
don't have a
people.
game yet.
Yeah. So many just young people in charge of this company. At this point they have experience. They've made Warcraft, they've made StarCraft, but this is a whole new operation for them, right? This whole MMO thing. The current big players are being funded by giants like EA and Sony, right? Yeah, so brand new thing for them. There was a designer named Twain Martin who basically said that his children kept referring to themselves as WoW orphans during the development because they would never see him. So midway through development, Adam ends up leaving again because this man just loved to take sabbaticals when he got tired. And,
wait, he wasn't even there when WoW launched?
No, he left before the launch. Because in fact, later on, it talks about how, he made plenty of money in the first couple acquisitions, but he never made that WoW money. And that's part of why he came back and wanted to, I'm not saying that's the only reason he came back, but it does mention that he made it known, like, man, I missed out on the true golden goose here. Like, I want to get back in.
The thing that Blizzard is now known for, and I helped start, like, I didn't get to reap the benefits of that.
Yeah. And that's, so that's really interesting, right? The number of people that participated in World of Warcraft or participated in Blizzard but didn't necessarily like become millionaires, right? It's another reason the book is so interesting is to read about this team of people that had such a cultural impact, but even though it's California and it's a tech company, they're making video games, but it is a tech company. It's not like Facebook, right? Like if you were one of the first 100 employees of Facebook, you have fuck you money now. That is not what being an early video game developer was like. And, Adam, you were talking about crunch time. One of the sadder moments for the book for me is like reading about like just how kind of screwed some of the early devs were out of just like their wages. And that comes up again later in Blizzard's history, right? Where people talk about paying a Blizzard tax just for the opportunity to work at such a great company. And it's always interesting and kind of tragic to read about the folks who, like come together, put a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and sacrifice into something that makes a huge cultural impact, and then don't necessarily seem the same payouts as some of the like higher ups or.
Well, and so many of them would go on to leave Blizzard because these other companies were just offering better salaries. It's like, hey, you got started at Blizzard, cool, come work for us, and we'll actually like pay you what you're worth in a way. And so they ended up losing, I feel like, a fair bit of talent due to that as well.
Honestly, that's another hugely interesting aspect of the book, right? Is just to see like what names pop up in early Blizzard, who left for various reasons, and then what they ended up doing.
Andy Weir.
yeah. Andy Weir, author of The Martian. If you've ever played a game called Guild Wars, the ArenaNet guys were at Blizzard.
Torchlight.
Yeah. If you ever played Torchlight and we're like, is this a Diablo clone? Yes, it's the same guys. It was the same guys.
it's like a Diablo spiritual sequel, if you will. Saying it's the same people.
It is a non-copyright infringing Diablo.
There's this old idea in economics about how like the most leverage a worker will ever have is like the ability to work for someone else, and that was certainly friggin' true for these Blizzard employees because like Riot and oh god, who are the other big ones over there? Valve, like those kind of companies would just come to these Blizzard employees and give them a number, and they would go to their manager to match it, and the manager would just look at it and be like, "You should just go to Riot Games. Like I'm not even gonna bother because they're offering you like 2.5 times. There's just no way. Like
we're not gonna do that."
Yeah, talking about not to get too corporate, like, inside baseball or whatever, but like that is just such an interesting phenomenon to me because, like, I don't know, we're all guys with office jobs, right? So we've worked in the corporate world. Like, so much of like corporate America is like, hey, retain your talent, retain the people who made things happen.
Yeah.
And reading this book, it's like sometimes it didn't seem like it was Blizzard's priority, and at the same time somehow they kept churning out, you know, smash hit successes. I mean, we'll talk later about when they failed, but it's just so surprising to see how often they let top talent go and still came out all right.
And I think part of that is just because people like a lot of that talent, a lot of the incoming new talent was like, oh my god, it's Blizzard. Like, I don't care if you're paying me in potatoes and, like, you know, noodles. Like, I want to work for Blizzard. I want to work for the company that created World of Warcraft or, you know, my childhood. And I think that carried a lot of weight for them. And you can see it throughout the book of the people who kind of, like, showed up there just because you're working at Blizzard. It's the coolest place to work ever, you know?
Yeah, I don't know if this is a tangent at this point, but I'm happy to stay on it. One of the parts is Patrick Wyatt goes to Rob Pardo after he is like slaved away on Warcraft 1, and he's like, hey, just kind of want to talk about my salary. And there's a quote where Rob Pardo says, like, you should be doing this for like the love of it, not the money. I like highlighted it and put like a vomit emoji. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
yeah.
like this,
I mean,
this is still a job, people. Like, you still need to be paying your employees.
yeah. Again, I mean, this is decades ago, right? And I'm sure we have all dealt with that side of kind of propaganda. It's nice to see that I think that isn't quite the cultural norm these days.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. Remember, kids, the line is, fuck you, pay me.
Yeah. It's just, they're not your friends. Remember that. But it was interesting because there were multiple times in the book where it talks about, like, every time they'd get absorbed by a new company, Morhaime had to kind of like convince that new company to restructure the profit sharing in order to get it to more people. It's hard to tell how much in like the early days they maybe had more control over that, but once they got absorbed by I think it was CUC International, which was in between Davidson and Vivendi, which my 12-year-old read as Cuck International the entire time.
Yeah, I was going to say, not to be crass, but that is the only way.
The entire
only way I could read that.
Yeah, don't worry, I did too. I laughed when I was reading over your notes because I was like, Cuck.
Yeah. So Warhammer is basically with every acquisition, he's like trying to more and more get more money into those people's hands. You know, I don't, obviously I'm not in the room. I can't tell you how much he actually fought for them, but it seemed like a decent bit.
And that was really important to, you know, kind of since we're talking about WoW overall, but just Blizzard's motto overall of like trying new things and trying to create new projects. It was always important, I think, for Morhaime and for the company to make sure the profit sharing was going to everybody, whether they were making a super successful project or not, because that's how you sparked those creative juices. Like, and you know, we'll talk about some of the places where that failed later on, but I think that's why he fought so hard for that, was just to make sure that everybody who is trying new things, and even if it didn't work out, they were still getting a share of all the Blizzard profits, because you couldn't make a WoW without trying something new. And if you didn't have incentive to do that, then what was the point? You know, why try something new? Why not just keep working on WoW if that's where all the profit sharing is going to go?
Yeah, I did have a lot of appreciation for how Morhaime specifically, again, this is one of the guys who founded the company and was probably there the longest, really wanting to protect Blizzard's culture of taking risks on things,
yes.
which is probably like what I'll say is the most like impressive or positive. The thing I want to celebrate the most about their Blizzard culture is that there is no reward without risk. You have to give, you know, smart, driven, creative people space to fail in order to, you know, really create something great.
And that might sound funny to some people, because I think in some people's mind, Blizzard was the company that just copied other ideas and made them better. But that's really kind of underselling it, because they weren't cheap copies. They were very much like, I'm taking what I really liked about this and I'm fleshing it out to make my own version with, you know, blackjack and hookers or whatever. Like, just a superior version to what the slop you have served me up, SOE.
Absolutely, yeah. And like, when you pile on top, I don't think Blizzard was like crowding out other indie developers in these spaces, right? Like, you know, there are other big name companies backed by big name publishers. Blizzard is not taking like a Google approach of acquiring anything that looks interesting and looting it for parts and then killing it, you know.
Blizzard kind of felt like the underdog when you compare like Sony Online Entertainment and EA. Like when you look at kind of the companies that were doing this stuff, it's like Vivendi isn't really a major player in the video game
Right.
space.
Which
Like-
is, maybe another point for the French utilities company. Yeah.
Some real visionaries over there. But now you were talking about, Austin, just how Morhaime was very insistent on everyone getting kind of credit for that. One thing they did with every one of their games is the very top part of the credits just says designed by Blizzard Entertainment, because they wanted to emphasize like this truly is a collaborative effort. And one thing that comes up over and over in this book is no one has a bad thing to say about Mike Morhaime. Like there's a lot of bad things to say about a lot of people in this book, and it happens,
Yeah.
and he is just really never one of them.
Yeah, that was definitely one of my biggest takeaways coming out of the book, is that like Morhaime seems like a very genuine leader, and like I'm sure some people had bad experiences with the guy. Like it would be almost impossible,
Especially early crunch days.
right? But at the end of the day, it feels like everybody who worked for him consistently had good things to say about him and respected his leadership and like what he did for the company and how he treated everybody. And like you were saying, with every acquisition, like he was fighting for the profit sharing, but he was also trying to reassure his entire staff, like, we're still Blizzard. Like, and he was so instrumental in making sure that at least for a long time, they always did remain still Blizzard.
Yeah, they mention that he was always very clever with the way his contracts were designed, that short of like committing federal crimes, he basically could not be fired. And he very much took advantage of that to shield his employees from like whatever nonsense might come from above.
Like, they were talking about plenty of the stories where, he would just have these like long battles with Bobby Kotick or whoever the, leaders were at the time. And like, it felt like the people below just didn't get any of that. They didn't hear any of that. He just took all of that and fought those battles behind closed doors, and then came back out to the staff and was like, cool, we're doing this and it's going to be awesome. And that's what a leader should do.
Yeah, he is absolutely someone who embodies kind of like a lead by doing mentality and trying to protect his teams from at least the whiplash of the worst, instincts of corporate America. But to give the cynical take, it's like, every time Morhaime gets new management, he's like, look, I already know how to get these rubes to work really hard, okay? Stop trying to fuck it up.
Right, like, please, just let me do my thing.
Yes, I've got it figured out. This is a money printing machine. Stop coming in here with your goddamn MBA and telling me how to make video games.
Right. That doesn't work.
And he really did have to stand up and figure out how to run this company, because Adam would usually be the one kind of doing more of the business side of things while he was just on the design side. Yeah, and since he would just every 3 years go fucking take a sabbatical, Morhaime really sort of learned how to be that president, although he does end up hiring a guy, I forget his first name, his last name is Sams. He ends up being a very important figure in early Blizzard because he's one of the few people that Morhaime ends up trusting to take care of that in his stead, because Morhaime, more than anything, just wants to focus on the games. What I thought was funny is there's a part where, despite Adam having left, there would be certain parts of the game, like there was a designer named Chris Zierhood, and he was telling Schrier, like, I would ask why some of these things were in the game, and people would just shrug their shoulders and say, that's an Alan feature. So that's staying in there. And everyone was like, well, okay, I guess he's not around to argue about it, so we'll just leave it in. So, Jeff, you had kind of mentioned being able to get these people to work so well together and so efficiently, and part of that was the creative process and how they would recruit internally a lot. And one of Morhaime's favorite things to do was to find people in the QA department and just have them try their hand at design. So there's this one designer, Christine Brownell. The way she ends up getting a job is that Morhaime says, hey, I want, so for this interview, for this application, everyone that wants to participate, make 5 quests using the WoW edit. She makes 5 quest chains using WoW edit. And Morhaime's just like blown away. And they're like, yes, immediately. And one of her things that she says is that Metzen, so Chris Metzen, right? This is the guy who back in Warcraft 1 came on as an artist, but ends up being a narrative guy because he would just doodle on the back of these cards like cool pictures and then write like, lore about the orcs and where they came from and all this stuff. And that ends up being expanded into, the whole like Warcraft 2 like manual. And But she was saying he would do such a good job creating these just overarching stories and places in these zones. And as the quest designers, we were completely free to do whatever we wanted within that context. And she even says, I don't know if I've ever experienced anything that gave me a more creative degree of freedom, right? So like to this day, she's like, working on World of Warcraft, I've never been allowed to be more creative like in my entire life.
Which is an incredible story to have. You bring up the QA department, though, which can also be seen as sort of a dark underbelly of Blizzard. I think literally for a lot of the company's history, they were on the ground floor, while all of the quote unquote real developers were on the second floor. And there was like a whole, pecking order and sort of drama behind like when you get hired as a QA person and, you put in your hours, are you going to be chosen? Will the developers
Ascension.
from on high? Yes, exactly.
Literally ascend to the second floor.
Yes. Will you become the anointed one and be chosen to join the ranks of the story devs upstairs? So there's an upside and a downside to promoting internally, right? And that again just brings me back to like, one of the best ways to keep your salary flat is to have long-term loyalty to a company. And while I'm sure going from QA to proper developer on a title certainly like increases like your income, increases the skills you get to exercise, it isn't necessarily always like the best way to build a career. And I'm sure you'll meet more than a few Blizzard QA people who are like, yeah, that kind of sucked. You should read about that part in the book, and particularly like complaints from QA managers who have been down in the depths for years and never got to be one of the anointed ones. But
Yeah, I mean, there really is a lot of detail we have to brush over because we don't want this to be a 20-hour podcast. But yeah, definitely go check that part of the book out because it really does fill in a lot of these gaps we'll leave. So now we're kind of getting to the point where this game is in a playable state and everyone wants to test it, right? And Morhaime is having everyone test it. And I think this was something he did with a lot of games is he's like, I had everyone from the secretaries and janitors to the executives play these games because I wanted to make sure that the types of people we were appealing to, it appealed to. So there's a funny bit in there where Shane Debris, he's one of the producers, and he basically has to get over the intercom and be like, guys, if you don't get back to work, I'm gonna have to take down the internal beta server because people just would not stop playing World of Warcraft at work. Like,
I know we told you guys to test the game, but now you need to finish the game. So,
and Jeff, you were mentioning Sony. There's a part in the book where he's interviewing John Smedley, which was the president of Sony at the time. And he basically says, yeah, we got arrogant. He says, oh my God, this ride is going to go on forever in regards to EverQuest and SW Star Wars Galaxies. And the other games, do you remember Infantry Online?
Oh my God, do I? Different podcast. Go ahead.
Yeah, they had the station pass with like that and a few other games, and you could include like an EverQuest subscription. They had all this online stuff figured out. And he actually said that when he played the WoW beta, he just said "row," like Scooby-Doo. That he was just like, oh shit, we are screwed.
Yeah.
So it was kind of came out of nowhere, but this beta just impressed everyone who played it. Competitors, fans, people who had never played a Blizzard game, people who had never played games. Suddenly, like, there's this huge online response to this game.
And I think that's really like, so that's we're talking about how everyone is testing it and like SOE, Sony just thought they had such a cash cow. I think what Sony failed to notice is just how dependent they were on people who were already gamers, right? Like none of the titles you mentioned were something that really broke into the mainstream. These were the games that like, people with a lot of free time on their hands, like teenagers would play a lot. Meanwhile, World of Warcraft was the kind of thing that had broad appeal, like the kind of thing that was easy to get into and could break into the mainstream. Like, I don't know. I was never going to get the casual person to sign up for Infantry.
Right.
And certainly not EverQuest. Meanwhile, Warcraft was just, approachable and lovable enough that, you could hate it one day and then center your whole personality around it the next.
It was always crazy to me how like successful WoW was, and MMOs in general, I guess, with just the idea of like paying monthly for a game at the time. Like that was always one of my big, as a kid, as someone who couldn't like afford it myself, I always felt weird like trying to ask my parents like, can you pay for this video game for me monthly, whenever I had like a PlayStation and like, you know, N64 or whatever it was that I would have that I'd be playing. And they're like, why do you want a game that I have to pay for you monthly to play? Like, just go buy one off the shelf, you know? But that didn't matter. Like, it still did so well, even having to buy a game and then on top of that pay for it monthly. Like, that was always really impressive to me.
Yeah, and I think that really illustrates how much World of Warcraft and Blizzard generally is also just a product of like the media and internet market at the time. One of the reasons World of Warcraft was so broadly popular is, you know, Adam, what did we do on the internet in 2004? What did the internet have to offer?
Right. A lot of it was hanging out in the form of like chat rooms or AOL Instant Messenger or those sort of things, right? And I think World of Warcraft kind of became an extended version of that. It really became like a world where you hung out and you met people. We don't really think of it that way today because now we're constantly online. We have Discord and texting. It's like you're never really away from people. But especially back then when we're teenagers without phones, it was like, oh, we get to come home from school and continue to hang out with our best friends in a much more interesting world than middle school. And I think that became such a core component to its success. Like,
yeah, you got to remember that, you know, 2003 is not the heyday of Twitter, all right? It's not like there are 7 different platforms out there that allow you to instantly communicate with whoever, whenever you want, with rich video and like media content all the time. None of that is there, right? Like, this is the era of like forum message boards, and AOL Instant Messenger is like the most advanced messaging products like on the market, right? And so a big part of these online games and online communities is just because they were so interesting to do for folks that had a lot of free time, or, you know, poor suburban teenagers with not a lot of things to do when you can't drive. It's really appealing to hang out online, and stuff like World of Warcraft was the most interesting thing to do.
And I mean, it shows when you look at the numbers. Like,
oh yeah.
Like, WoW launched in November 2004, and within 4 months, it would already have 1.5 million subscribers. Like,
yeah. So EverQuest had peaked at around 500,000, and I guess it was after 2 or 3 years of the game being up. So Moorham's like, hey, if we can get to that by the end of the first year, that'll be great. It sold 250,000 on its very first day. And within 4 months, like you said, 1.5 million. I mean, it transforms the company overnight. The response is ridiculous. There's a story in the book where how they're at one of these almost like a Fry's Electronics type shop out in California. And they're kind of expecting some people to show up for launch. They'll sign some copies. They'll go home. The line was like wrapping around the building. They said when they approached it from a distance, they didn't know what it was. They were like, what is this blob around the store? Then they're like, oh my God, that's people lining up to buy our game. They're signing it all night. They have secretaries running back to the office to get all of the copies that were reserved for employees and bring them to the store and sign those and give them to fans because they're running out of the shop. They're running out in the headquarters. I mean, the response was just otherworldly.
Yeah, I mean, it's the best kind of problem to have, right? Like the number one thing you want is to run out of your product. And
yeah.
it's always fun to read stories about folks who just like couldn't even begin to imagine that what they're working on would ever be that popular.
Well, and like you had said, it really did change kind of the task at Blizzard. I like this story about the composer who was doing Matt Uelman, who was working on the guitars and things for Diablo, and was just like he got moved over to Blizzard headquarters and was like, yeah, you have to write for WoW now. And I was like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Like, this thing is just making so much money that there was no choice. It was just like, you need to have as much staff on WoW as possible, because it was just making the kind of money that companies couldn't even fathom.
Yeah, really like the first subscription I can ever think of having. It certainly must be, just because I was young at the time, the first thing I ever actually subscribed to. And now here in the modern world, I'm not aware of anything I actually own anymore. I guess
I'm about to say, do you do anything besides subscribe to stuff?
And, you know, to their credit, in 2003, World of Warcraft was $15 a month. Adam, how much is it today?
It's still $15 a month.
incredible.
That is pretty insane. That is pretty impressive.
They definitely try to nickel and dime you in brand new ways, but the subscription itself.
I was about to say, and it works. They make money on the nickel and diming for sure, but
you can pay real cash for mounts now. But yes,
yeah. But to just get into the game, you can still pay the same thing you were paying in 2003, or 2004, which is pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which, as much as I hate on Blizzard for being like not typical corporate America, but still being like very much a product of corporate America, they are not a company that you can really look at and be like, oh, they're in it just to extract as much value as possible from the player, right? They actually did a good job of sticking to the corporate mantra of building things for players, as opposed to, maybe folks from Activision would have liked.
I mean, especially in these early days. I mean, it did definitely feel very much like everything was player focused. Like I know Blizzard literally built like a statue in front of their headquarters to put their mantra there, but they did do a really good job of sticking to that mantra.
Yeah, the thing Warhammer always says in this book is like if you make stuff for the players, then the profits will come. Right, like it's just focus on the players, and that is very much his philosophy, and you can really see that all through this book. One of the things I found interesting is, this game blows up overnight. You have the more obvious things. You got to deal with servers, but there was a law school dropout who had joined the staff of Blizzard the year before because everyone wanted to work for this company, and he convinced them like, hey, we should really have like game masters, like, so it shouldn't be some queue that it goes into and then people outside the game try to answer these questions. Like, we should have people who are actively in the game being like GMs, game masters that are helping people with these problems. So they end up just hiring as many young people around the area as they can and putting them in this room like, you're a game master now. The way Jeremy Masker says it is he's like, if you had a pulse and you knew anything about Warcraft, we'd put you in front of a keyboard. And then from there, there's two guys within the company that have even a bigger idea, right? They, E3 has become such a big thing by this point. And they're like, so this is Paul Delabita and Matt Kassan. They're two managers at Blizzard. And they basically pitched the idea to Morhaime, like, what if we have our own convention just for our fans and our games? Like, we don't need to pay all this money to E3 for most of our time to be spent with people walking by our booth. Like, we will be every booth. And so Morhaime likes the idea, and he basically says, let's put an ad up on the WoW launcher just to see the response. The tickets sell out before that day, right? It's only on the WoW launcher is where they're being sold. You can't go to their website. You can't go to this. It's just, you probably can go somewhere on the website, but that's where they're really targeting is like people playing World of Warcraft. When you boot up the game, you'll click this. Not StarCraft, not Diablo, World of Warcraft. And by the first day, they have 8,000 people who want to come to freaking BlizzCon.
And I think that's really like, and he kind of frames the book around, or ends the book on, what the state of BlizzCon today is. But I would say you really know you've made it as a company when you're willing to get tens of thousands of strangers to like fly out and just hang out to talk about your company. Like I realize this is like the early 2000s. When was the first BlizzCon? I lost track of the year.
I guess it would be 2005. 2004 was when it launched, and I think it was the next year.
Yeah, I gotcha. So mid 2000s, and I feel like Comic-Con's been a thing for a long time, but gaming conventions like this were sort of a new thing, at least for video games, right? Like comic books and other fan conventions are certainly something, but like a video game company like hosting people like for real, just about their games. This is a newer thing in the world.
So getting back to one of the things you were talking about earlier with some of these people that have been slaving away on this game. I say slaving away, working long hours on this game. They were being paid. I want to be fair. This was not forced servitude. There was money
happening.
But like some of them were basically saying, the bonuses would come in and they'd be like $2,000, and you're like, are you serious? Like this, this revenue is insane, and this is what we're getting. So this is where Morhaime starts fighting with Vivendi. Like, we have to be able to restructure these things. This is where the employees are going to Pardo, and he's like, you should be doing it for pride. And it's like, give me a fucking break. So some guys are leaving. Designer James Chadwick, though, he stuck around a little longer, and he was like, I'm really glad I stuck it out, because when I received my second bonus check and it was $25,000, I was like, okay, pretty soon my bonus checks were outpacing my actual pay. And so I think for the people who actually stuck around, I think they found it worth it, but it is really unfortunate for anyone who like kind of dipped out right after launch because they were like, I'm never going to get my piece of this pie.
100%.
So then, by the end of the first year, WoW has 5 million subs. So they 10 times their target by the end of year one. Just insane. And Austin, you mentioned it. They move out of their tiny little Irvine office. There's a part in the book where a new employee shows up and he looks around and he's like, "This is Blizzard's headquarters." Like,
because it looked like a shithole.
Tens of millions of dollars a month, and like this is their headquarters. So by 2008, they have basically built a Facebook-like campus out in Irvine, California. No, it wasn't in Irvine, or still in Irvine. I can't remember, but somewhere out in California, right? Not too far from where they were. And like you said, Austin, they have the giant statue of an orc riding the giant direwolf, and he's on this pedestal with the 8 Blizzard like slogans around it. And that I think that's really when they become like who a lot of people think of them now as this huge company. I mean, it's really like a year after World of Warcraft where they're just rolling in dough. Their reputations never be hired. They have all of this like internal momentum.
Well, I mean, even at this time, they're literally getting South Park episodes created about them. I mean, the Make Love Not Warcraft episode is still one of the like most iconic things about South Park, I think, to this day.
Emmy award-winning episode of TV. It actually probably isn't, but in my mind it is.
It might be. I mean, it varies. It's very possible that it could be.
If it's not, it got fucking robbed.
That's one of my first exposures to World of Warcraft. I wasn't even a big South Park fan, but like just being in the culture, right? Seeing this, I mean, it was almost, you could almost argue that episode is inspiration for the 2 South Park games that currently exist.
100%.
That were both really successful RPGs in their own right. Like, all based on this game that has nothing to do with South Park. Like,
and the book mentions that for months you have Blizzard executives and designers flying over to Colorado to work with the South Park guys and vice versa. I mean, this wasn't something that their internal animators were able to just do on their own. Blizzard helped them like recreate stuff in this engine so they could have it all mapped out and everything. I mean, it really was a collaborative effort there, and I definitely think it was worth it.
Yeah, it's a novel achievement in animation, particularly for like a TV show, and that just kind of speaks to their interesting culture of taking risks on things and also committing to them, right? There was never a point in time where they were, trying to walk back this idea of doing an episode with South Park or trying to shut down the animation teams. They were willing to collaborate and do something different. Oh, and their headquarters is still in Irvine, California. Okay. I'm staring at that orc statue right now. I think Google's house.
Oh, I thought you meant, okay, I was like, are you in California? Are you recording this on the street?
No, that would be
actually
a cool
in
flex,
front of Blizzard right now.
You guys didn't know I changed jobs?
What a twist.
So World of Warcraft is a huge success, and as we say, it really does change the company. And you start seeing these little cracks around the seams of some of the like good culture they had. Although, as we'll get to later, not everyone thought the culture was great. But one of the things I thought was interesting is that it would get to the point where there would be arguments at lunch between the different team members. So you have the Diablo team, the StarCraft team, and the Blizzard or the World of Warcraft employees would just like play a trump card and be like, yeah, well, we're paying for your game, so and it's apparently like a common rebuttal to like actual game design arguments. And it's like, oh, what are we, children? But yeah, a lot of them kind of are. A lot of them are in their 20s, right? The young men.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, right, as like kind of shitty as a thing as that is to say, like it kind of was true. Like Blizzard could have and take the risk and the chances that they could because WoW was literally printing money.
I mean, sure, but that was always sort of like the intention around how they organized their culture,
sure.
Right? Was to give people the ability to take risk. It definitely, as funny as it is for them to be like, you exist because we allow it. I don't necessarily commend them for that.
No,
but,
it's definitely not a good attitude to have, but I can understand why it would have gone to people's heads.
100%. Well,
yeah.
Like Adam is saying, young nerdy dudes aren't exactly known for their conflict resolution abilities. So
if I worked on World of Warcraft when I was 22, I would have no fucking friends. Like I would be the most insufferable person.
Like, oh yeah, well, I work on World of Warcraft.
I would not be able to say anything without fucking bringing it back to how I work on World of Warcraft. I would be the worst. So a lot of people will kind of talk about Activision as like a turning point for Blizzard and World of Warcraft. This acquisition occurs in 2008. Vivendi is trying to get rid of its video game division for years, but no one really wants the whole thing. People really just want Blizzard, and they're like, no, but we want to sell the whole thing. And eventually, Bobby Kotick of Activision talks him into like, no, I don't want all that shit. I just want World of Warcraft, or Blizzard, and you're going to give it to me. So that ends up happening. And it was a really interesting acquisition, too, because the way it first goes down, Bobby Kotick actually loses control of Activision, right? He no longer has a 50% plus share. But then, like, over the next few years, he finds a way to, like, work his way back in, because of course he does. But it's important to point out that, like, WoW's peak was Wrath of the Lich King, which came out in 2012. And this is when they had 12 million subs. Now, this is just Western company subs, because how they do it in China is counted totally differently. So this doesn't even include the money they're making from China, right? So 12 million non-Chinese monthly $15 a month subscribers. Absolutely crazy. And it got to the point where, like, you remember the global economic crisis happened in 2008 and lasted a few years. Activision execs are basically talking about how, like, yeah, we're immune to that. Like, the whole global economy collapsed, and we're just like, it does not matter to us. And a large part of that is World of Warcraft, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We are above macroeconomic conditions. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what WoW has done for us.
When your player base gives you like a tank of gas worth of money every month just to be in their world, you make money. So
I didn't realize before reading the book, and I mean, like, I knew that Blizzard was owned by Activision, and I've known that for a long time, but I didn't realize it happened so early.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Like,
yeah.
It feels like it happened so early in their existence. I mean, 2007, right? Is when...
Well, I think part of that is because they have a very good relationship for a number of years before they don't. So I think a lot of people forget how early it started, because it went well in the beginning, and that's true. People don't really remember that part.
It started with positivity.
Yeah, it takes time for corporate amalgamations to happen, and when you're in a war of attrition, you got to grind down the opponent, blah blah blah. So.
Sir, this is a Wendy's.
Sorry, couldn't help myself. But yeah, it's basically the story of World of Warcraft doesn't really end with like this huge climactic thing, right? I mean, it's still going, but some of the major things to think about are like, so that is its peak, which means when the next expansion comes out, there's less subs, and when the next expansion comes out, there's next subs, and by the time it's Warlords of Draenor, which I believe is the fifth overall expansion, they're at 5.5 million subscribers, and they just stop reporting them. They basically say, hey, so for their investors, the way they swing it is there are better metrics for how much money this game's actually making than just subs, which at that point was true, because you had the Sparkle Pony that came out in Wrath of the Lich King, the $20 flying unicorn. And from there, they would introduce like level boosts and all kinds of things. So they're like, hey, our monthly subs are no longer the most accurate way to really track our revenue. So we're going to stop reporting them, which I do think is true. But also, like, they wanted to stop reporting them because they're now at less than half of their peak, 3-4 years later. They just don't want to keep drawing attention to that.
Yeah, I mean, I am fully on board with lying to investors. In fact, so was the Activision, or no, sorry, was that Cuck International?
Oh, yeah, that was Cuck.
Maybe don't lie too much, y'all. So, anyway.
Yeah, someone got indicted over fraud there, and it was an interesting cross of universes because that lead lawyer was Chris Christie of New Jersey.
Oh yeah.
Whoa! Let's not make this political.
So I just found that very interesting, right? Because it kind of came out of nowhere, and I was like, Chris Christie, huh? Yeah, I didn't expect his name to pop up in my Blizzard expose, right?
Yeah, ultimate crossover, Blizzard Entertainment.
What a weird cameo.
Chris Christie's gonna be a new hero in Heroes of the Storm.
Little known fact: he actually was responsible for Arthas's downfall. I heard.
Oh wow, yeah, it's really doing it. So they, as the game starts to kind of lose subs, internally at Blizzard, they're trying to figure out okay, so what's really important here is that we keep hitting these revenue targets, and more importantly, we the people that are still here, we need them to stay. And they're looking at the numbers, and they're like, there's a veteran there, Greg Street. He says, it was obvious to everyone who looked at it. When did we get more money and when did we get more subscriptions? It was when we shipped an expansion, right? So Kotick Activision's been pressuring them hey, EA has 2 teams working on Battlefield. We have 2 teams working on Call of Duty. 2 2 to 3 years, but I'm sorry, every year, but they're actually being worked on for 2 to 3 years, right, by different studios. Why can't we do that with WoW? And at one point, J. Allen Brack even gets the team together for this very like RFK-esque, JFK-esque speech. Very different. Guys, we need to drink more flaxseed oil and get rid of the fluoride in the water. No.
Let's say RFK on the mind lately. I get it.
It was described as a JFK-esque speech because he was basically talking about like, why do we choose to go to the moon? Because it's hard. Why do we choose to make an expansion every single year? Because it's hard and we can do it. And there was a couple of comments in there. One guy was like, overall, it wasn't a bad plan. It just failed miserably because we could never get a second team of basically leadership, right? They were like, we could get the workers, we could get the designers, but we never found that core group of people that could run a second team the same way the first team did. So they end up never going to the one expansion a year thing, which was probably good. But what I thought interesting is there was an engineer named Kyle Radu who was like, these expansions were so inefficient, and it was always because of design, right? It's like these games would sit in pre-production for months and months as people argued over like all of the lore stuff and what should the new classes should be. And he said the engineers would kind of just sit in there twiddling their thumbs like, boy, we sure would love to have something to work on right now. And so it's kind of hard, not being in the room, it's very hard to tell. And this book is pretty good about getting everyone's perspectives. But the downside of that is like, I don't really know. Was it mostly a design? Oh, shoot. 3, 2. Was it mostly a design holdup, or was it mostly a programming, engineering thing? It does seem like there was a lot going on, but I can totally believe, based off some of the other stories in this book, that these designers just wanted everything to be so perfect and so thought out that they probably did not discard ideas as willingly as they should have.
Yeah, collaboration is hard, and I completely understand the discussion of like, we just couldn't stand up a second team with the right leadership because creative work is just very different from producing other kinds of things. And sometimes it is highly dependent on the specific people you have in the room, what their working relationships are, and what they are willing to do together. And, I am never going to be the guy to hold up Activision and be like, what we need more of, Call of Duty-esque every year expansions, like that right there. That's the pinnacle of gaming, is buying the same thing reskinned for $60 every year. Yeah.
So that more or less wraps up the story of WoW. There's a lot more related to it, and we will definitely, as some of our other subjects get covered here, there's definitely more to talk about Activision-wise too, for sure. But yeah, is there anything else you guys want to say about WoW before we move into the next thing? I think we covered a good bit of it, and I think the main takeaways are that like the company that existed 6 months prior to WoW's release and the company that existed 6 months after WoW's release are just basically two different companies, and that's sort of the main takeaway, I think. So you guys may remember me mentioning earlier how Blizzard executives thought there was a particular black sheep of their gaming suite, and that was always the Diablo franchise. And if you're wondering why that is, it's because it turns out Diablo did not originate from within Blizzard Irvine. It was the brainchild of 3 men named David Brevik, Eric Schaefer, and Max Schaefer, who formed a company called Condor, who would later be known as Blizzard North. Did you guys play any of the original Diablo?
Diablo is such a wild franchise to me. It might be the only game I can think of that, like, I don't know, I've bought in every decade of my life, right? Like, that I've existed in.
Yeah.
Whatever. Like, I guess I probably didn't pay for Diablo 2. I definitely stole that, right? Those are the land days where we're all just trading copies.
Pass around the burn CD.
Yeah, Diablo 2. Diablo 3, Diablo 4. I'm very familiar with it. Have I actually sunk hundreds of hours into it? No. I've sunk dozens into Diablo 2. But you know what? It's funny. We have this, my wife has this sign, this cute little kitschy sign that says stay a while. And all I can think is end listen every time I see it. Yeah. It's this decor in our home. And I'm just like, oh, that has to go by the front door. All right. I need you to custom design the and listen part someday. So.
I had never played a Diablo outside of like, I think that may have been another one where like you or a different friend of mine had Diablo, and I was like, I had seen other people play it, but I had never played any Diablo really until Diablo 3. I dabbled a little bit with you and Connor on Diablo 3. And then we all picked up Diablo 4 and played that for about 3 hours and never touched it again.
I wish I could say why, because we all bought that game like at launch, like full price. And we're like,
literally day
Diablo
one.
4.
Like we were like, yeah, Diablo 4, woo.
3 hours in, we were like, is this the most boring game I've ever played? I don't know what was wrong with it, but it bounced off that hard.
I'm about to say, like, nothing on paper made it feel bad, but like there was nothing about it that I could directly point to be like, I don't want to play this, but I just never wanted to play it. And maybe some of that, I mean, I know it wasn't the case for you because you did have experience with Diablo 2 and 3, but I never did have that experience. I never was there with like the heyday, the glory of Diablo 2 or even Diablo 1. So I only knew that from, hearing about it in the zeitgeist.
Yeah, I'd say the vast majority of my experience with it was Diablo 2, at just various little LAN parties. I don't think I ever even played the first one, and I played like a little bit of the third and fourth, but 2 is definitely my like fondest memory. And there's actually a remastered version that they've made. That's pretty cool. I think it's called like Diablo 2 Resurrection. But getting back to the origin of the game here. So these three gentlemen, David, Max, and Eric, they are going to the Consumer Electronics Show to show off their game and or to try to get a publisher to bite on their game. And no one cares about it, right? They talk to all these publishers, no one cares. But they end up stumbling across this booth, and much like Blizzard at the time, they're paying the bills by porting these games to different systems. And they come across their game at someone else's booth, and they're like, what the hell? And they go up and they start talking to the guys, and they realize, oh, they're making it for Super Nintendo. We're making it for Sega Genesis. But they kind of start talking about it, and they realize they have very similar outlooks on game design and business philosophy and all these things. So over the coming months, Alan Adam stays in contact with these guys, and him and Pat Wyatt would end up flying up to Condor a couple times. They're up in Northern California. And basically, they get their hands on Diablo, and they're just instantly like, this game is awesome. They're in the process of trying to sell or get someone to publish it because they're not going to be able to get this game out on their own. So Blizzard's like, we would love to publish it, but Adam says, I have two things. One, we have to add multiplayer, and 2, we're removing the turn-based system. And Brevik at first is, he's a huge fan of like the old Ultima games and just all these turn-based RPGs. He's like, there's no way in hell we're doing that. But eventually Adam convinces him, and he says, the moment we changed it to real time, I knew it was the right call. And can you guys imagine a turn-based Diablo?
I don't know how that works.
Yeah, what a weird concept that would be.
Yeah. I think DNA ends up acquiring them, or maybe they get wrapped into Blizzard once Cuck International takes over. Sorry, I'm never going to be able to stop doing that.
Every time.
We are
Every time.
And there's a lot of similarities with early Blizzard here because, the Schaefers and Brevik receive a big payout, but a lot of disgruntled employees are like, hey, like, we crunched on this game. Where's our fair share? They end up getting some stock options to stay with the company. So they give some guys some raises and some title changes. So for the most part, they're able to keep people happy enough to stay on board. But one thing that Blizzard's influence on the game ends up doing is what they call these 3 endorphin rushes in the book. So it's that gameplay loop of you find the loot, and you're like, hell yeah, I got a sword, a mystery sword of something. I love swords. Then you go identify it, and you're like, it's a flaming sword of something. I love flames. And then you go and actually get to use it, and you're like, it catches things on fire. This is awesome. And it was that core loop of over and over of getting something that looked cool, going through a identification process to see what it actually is, and then going back out to use it, see how awesome it is, and in the meantime, picking up more loot to repeat the cycle. And this just became this like addictive loop that is now the foundation for this entire genre of games.
Were they the first game to do the like colorizing of loot?
I think so.
Ooh.
Because that is pervaded into literally every game. I mean, I was literally playing the Atlas's new Metaphor game just minutes ago, and I came across like a gold, like a gold shiny sword, and I was like, oh man, it's gold. That means it's good. Like,
Yep. Blue is.
Even if it didn't start, I do know that the color scheme they ended up going with for WoW would be the one that everyone in the world copied after that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that is 100% true. And I think they did draw inspiration from the Diablo one. I'm not sure if it's the exact same number of colors, but I think, blue is better than green, green is better than gray. Like that's 100% a Diablo thing.
Right. And like that just goes to show that this company, even at the time, like was just doing things that would change the landscape forever, even back in the Diablo days.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's permanent now, right? Like that is the Fortnite loot color scheme too, which means it's just never going to go away.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, it's literally like you can't change it. People would be like, I don't understand. Like, what color is good?
Oh man, that was something I wanted to mention earlier. So WoW subs start dropping 6 years after it comes out. That's when their peak is reached. This is Fortnite's 6th year of Battle Royale, I believe. So just something to keep an eye on, just to see what happens.
Interesting.
And there is no stopping. They have not yet reached peak content, boys.
No, they're at like 500 million registered users right now or something.
Let's say,
I don't know how many
Fortnite
active,
is free, but Fortnite is free. Let's keep that in mind.
True.
But...
Yes, it's a different era of gaming for sure. But talk about kind of like how we talked about on the Halo episode. Not to get too meta for a minute, but it's a bit of a changing of the guard with Blizzard these days, right? Like if you were to talk about Blizzard in 2011, a huge, cultural impact. Lots of people know what you're talking about. Same way if you talked about Halo in 2005. These days, people don't really talk about Halo all that much, and World of Warcraft is not the most popular online multiplayer experience anymore. Sorry, Adam, I've now interrupted your story about Diablo North.
No, it's okay. This is what this is about. Just going off on Blizzard tangents. But, as much as Condor and Blizzard had in common, upon working on Diablo, they would sort of also realize that there were some big cultural differences too. Like Irvine, so we'll start, for the purposes of the story, we'll call them now Blizzard North and Blizzard Irvine. We'll get a little bit into when they actually become Blizzard North. But so the employees at North have a very, very laid back attitude, and they're also very content to figure things out on the fly. So Diablo was released with, a few issues here and there that they end up rolling out online patches for, which was, I think, kind of risky because at the time that wasn't, a super ubiquitous thing. Not everyone had high-speed internet, but I think enough people had it to where if they really had problems with the base version, they could update it. But Irvine had a very different philosophy. They were like, no, we take the time to polish these things and release them right because that's what the players expect. And we don't want to get in the habit of them not buying our games at launch because they don't think they're going to be good for the first 3-4 months, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a big point of contention. Also, just the creative control. A lot of the Condor employees thought they'd have a lot more independence. But Irvine kind of came in and was like, no, like you're under our house now. This is how we're going to do things. And there was also a big back and forth about the artwork, right? So Blizzard's style was much more vibrant, colorful. The first Diablo game was very dark. It was very bloody. So even into the creation of Diablo 2 and 3, there's just this constant back and forth of the old guard wanting to be like, no, we want it to be dark, and then there's going to be blood and gore. And Blizzard Irvine being like, no, there's not, because this is our project now. And despite the fact that years later we're going to say it's not a real game, we care enough right now to shape it the way we want to, right? And at one point they get into how it ends up becoming Blizzard North, which is that the executives at Blizzard North, so you have 3 guys I mentioned earlier, the 2 Schaefer brothers and David Brevik, and then a guy that Blizzard has put over there called Bill Roper, who's now like kind of the head of Condor. They have a big dispute with Vivendi where they think Vivendi's not being transparent enough about like what are their projections for Diablo and Diablo 2? What are their expectations, profit sharing, this and that? And they basically all threaten to resign if this doesn't become more transparent. And Vivendi says, here's 4 pink slips. So...
Yep, called your bluff.
Their bluff gets called. Those 4 guys are gone. Morhaime and Adam suddenly find themselves in charge of a whole new studio. Up to this point, they had already tried to convince Brevik and the Schaefers to come down to Irvine. They didn't want to, but this was finally their chance. They're like, guys, we are absorbing you. You are now officially Blizzard North. And they end up laying off about a third of the staff because there's a lot of redundancies, but they keep the vast majority on them, and they keep them on Diablo because they like the direction of this. They've liked the influence they've had. They still like the old workers. They want this to be a hit. They're not trying to like totally dismantle the whole team. But, now you're coming to Irvine. You're going to be on a closer watch. But before they make that decision, they send Pat Wyatt up to Blizzard North, right? And he's saying, hey, I'm going back and forth between this motel 7 days a week, 16-hour shifts trying to get this damn game shipped with multiplayer capability. He says in retrospect, this was very foolish of me, but at the time, I just felt like no one at this damn company cared about saving it half as much as I did, right? And if they don't care to save themselves, then why should I? And that ended up being such a huge part of why Morhaime decides, let's just wrap them in to Blizzard Irvine, because they're too far away. They have a different culture. They're not responding to our liaisons that go up there. Let's bring them in. They even offer Brevik a spot on the team, and Brevik's like, no, I want to go do my own thing. That was Hellgate London, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a little bit of a crash and burn, but...
I mean, you got to try.
So Diablo ends up becoming an all-hands product where both Blizzard North and Blizzard, everyone is on it, trying to finish this, right? They pull some guys off. It's probably Warcraft 2 at the time, Warcraft 3, I can't remember the exact timeline. But it's just this constant back and forth of like, we want Blizzard North to be basically an extension of us, and Blizzard North wants to keep their independence. That ultimately just gets settled by Morhaime saying there is no more Blizzard North. You're just Blizzard.
Yeah, you would say that Irvine won that fight.
Yes.
And if you're wondering why Diablo 2 was released in 2000 and Diablo 3 was released in 2012, this is why. The original Blizzard was busy consuming the original developers of Diablo 2, and that's why it took them 12 years. And Irvine certainly won most of the battles, although apparently not the quality one. I don't know, I can't remember the launch of Diablo 3. Did it come out to rave reviews, or did they have to patch that a lot?
It wasn't the kind of gameplay itself that was a problem. I think a lot of players took issue with that real money auction house, and in particular, it was that the loot in the in-game felt so rare and scaled back that people were basically saying like, oh, I see why you made this real money auction house, because you just want people to go buy the gear that they can't get in the end game. And the book makes it pretty clear that this was not what they were trying to do, but it's sort of fair that the players felt this way because they really screwed up the balance of the end game on release.
Yeah, you could even kind of call this one of the first examples of Blizzard getting something just totally wrong, which is something they're going to do more in the future. But this is one of the risks you run where your fundamental ethos is that, oh, we're building a game for us, and this seems fun for us, and this seems to make sense to us. And then when you release it and the entire world is like, why are you screwing me over? It's like, oh, actually, we have made a mistake. To their credit, they rectify that, right, Adam? I think later they completely revamp how the auction house works.
Yeah, no, they basically in the first expansion, they reworked a bunch of stuff, including that. And it ended up being kind of a reputation recovery. But unfortunately, and at that point, the writing, or it had already been kind of set in stone that they weren't going to do a second Diablo 3 expansion. They were just going to start on Diablo 4 because they were like, hey, we turned our reputation around on this game. Let's not risk it again. Let's leave this in good standing and move on to the next project is ultimately what they went with. But I'm glad you bring up Diablo 3 because one of the things I kind of forgot to mention a minute ago, one of the reasons ultimately it gets absorbed in is because after Diablo 2 comes out, like it's a hit, it's a good game. They're still Blizzard North at this point. 3 years go by and they've got nothing on Diablo 3. It is a constant, like, part of it's a little bit of like a frat house culture. These guys are just playing video games all day. There was a newcomer that came in and was like, literally people would come in, they would play games until lunch, then they would go to lunch where they had a meeting for an hour, then they'd come back and play games and go home at 3. And that this was just happening for months and months. And not only that, but the 3 founders had all kind of taken, an Adham like sabbatical after Diablo 2 because they were so burned out.
I mean, yeah, exactly. That's why that happened, right?
Yeah.
That's why a new employee is showing up to an office where everyone is just playing video games all day.
Because the adults left the room. And
Well,
the adults left, but they had also just poured their lives into months of actually finishing Diablo 2. And really, they're sitting around waiting for some sort of leadership to like drive them on to the next mission. And it is not remotely surprising to me that the company wasn't eager to work hard after having just crunched for so long.
Yeah.
And this could also be kind of a byproduct of something that we didn't really mention at the end of Diablo, like talking about the original Diablo. That game had missed its launch date window. Like it was supposed to launch right before Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
And they just kind of pushed it out because they weren't ready to be done yet. And they're like, we'll just launch in January. And of course, their executives were just like, no, we need to hit Christmas. And they're like, yeah, it'll be fine. And then it was fine. I mean, they launched, and I think it was a GameSpot review that was like, Diablo is the best game to come out in the last year. Period. Go buy it.
Yeah, I was going to say that can be the origin of a bit of their hubris, and I agree. And I think it's a really illustrative example of like when you have a good product on your hands, everything else just falls into place. When you fundamentally make something that people want and it is exciting, it doesn't matter, if you time the market right, blah, blah, blah. But if you don't, it's also a fantastic way to get like absolutely nothing out of all your work. So
Yeah.
it makes sense that people try and, game release timing so that it'll work out best for the company. And that's why corporate culture is so excited about that. But legitimately, if you do things right, you don't have to worry about that.
A mediocre product could potentially benefit from the right release window, the right time. It can maybe stand out in a way that it wouldn't otherwise, but like a truly great product will stand out no matter what. And I think that was Blizzard's motto for a long time, and I think that started with Diablo. As the book kind of talks about how that kind of starts with Diablo and with this experience of missing Christmas, and they would go on to have that attitude for a long time, and it worked out for them because for a long time Blizzard was putting out really quality products.
And that's just another difficult thing to scale in a corporate organization. Go ahead, Adam.
No, yeah, absolutely. I was gonna say that's where their mantra, it'll be ready when it's ready, really came from, right? And one of the things the book talks about is like back in 2002, that was cool because that meant 3 months, right? As these games get more complex, it ends up meaning like 3 years sometimes, and it just ends up being like you said, maybe start of the start of their hubris. I mean, I think I wouldn't call that in itself hubris, but maybe they don't wield that philosophy properly going forward.
That's what I would say. I think at the time that philosophy made a lot of sense and worked because it was like, let's put out the best product possible. But eventually, when, like you said, when games take 4 years to come out, if you keep delaying them, it's like the best product possible doesn't necessarily matter if you haven't put out a game in 8 years.
Yeah, so that's kind of the end of the Diablo 2 story in Blizzard North. We will cover, I think, Diablo 3 more in depth later because there's the whole saga with Jay Wilson, which is a real doozy. But yeah, Diablo 2 and 1 were basically made by almost like a sister studio, and then they get wrapped in under their wings, and everyone more or less associated with Blizzard, except some of the Blizzard execs who just continue to see it as the black sheep, I think particularly after the Diablo 3 failure. But is there anything else about this era of Blizzard you guys want to touch on?
We've kind of alluded on and off to like the actual corporate culture inside of Blizzard in the 90s and the 2000s. Do we want to talk more in depth about like just how much a frat house it was?
Let's head there next. So coming out of these immense successes so far, we have Warcraft, Warcraft 2, Warcraft 3, Diablo, Diablo 2, World of Warcraft, all just smash hits. Blizzard can never do anything wrong. Well, over the coming years, there would be a number of times that they kind of shoot themselves in the foot, or maybe in the head while aiming for their foot, depending on how you want to look at this. I say my personal favorite one to talk about is, and these might not be in chronological order, but the World of Warcraft Classic saga, right? So basically, over the years, they start releasing all these expansions, and particularly the third one called Cataclysm, like totally reshapes the game world, right? Very reminiscent of something like FF14, Austin, the Realm Reborn, right? Except the game didn't suck, and they were remaking it for that reason, but still just like
a different kind
of world makeover, yeah. So what ends up happening is there's a BlizzCon, and J. Allen Brack, whose name comes up a lot in this book, he is like one of the heads of Blizzard and then takes over as president when Morhaime leaves. He's on this panel, and one of the Q&As, right, this kid walks up and he's like, hey, I say kid, guy. Everyone looks like a nerd at BlizzCon, a kid, I don't know what to say about that. But this guy walks up and he's like, hey, have you guys ever considered releasing servers as they were in those expansions? And there's a short silence before J. Allen Brack just says, no. And the crowd kind of like laughs. And he's like, and by the way, you don't want that either. You think you do, but you don't. And then he starts basically riffing on all of these quality of life improvements that retail WoW has added over the years. And this became a fucking internet rallying cry, right? You think you do, but you don't. I mean, it's on every message board. People are trashing the guy. And part of that is because this private server scene has really blown up, right? So you have this one called Nostalrius, which is just a classic server. And, they don't have all of the code and all of the stats, so they reverse engineer it the best they can. Some of the bosses are unbalanced and some of the abilities don't work. But for the most part, it is a fully functioning World of Warcraft classic server. This thing gets like 800,000 accounts before Blizzard shuts it down. And after Blizzard shuts it down, of course, people are upset and they're like, dude, if you won't let us start our own classic communities, it's really only right that you give us one, right? We'll gladly pay you. We'll gladly take the Blizzard version of this, but God damn it, we want classic World of Warcraft.
Man, private MMO servers is just something I will be endlessly fascinated about, right? We started talking about how Blizzard started with like a bunch of guys who really wanted to take something they loved and make it better. And fundamentally, this is what those MMO private servers are. Like, these guys played a game back in the day that they loved, and they want to make it better. They want to make it themselves, but they just can't, right? Like, you can't take the World of Warcraft IP and host your own server. That's just not how economics or copyright law works. So it's I don't know. It is both incredibly impressive to me when folks put up their own private MMO servers. We're going to play some of the Star Wars Galaxies ones one day, I swear to God. And also it like speaks to me as like, those are the guys, the people putting up these private servers are exactly the guys who would go out and like start Blizzard today. Like they are the same kind of people, but it is no longer the kind of like media market or video game market where that really even makes sense. So instead, these enthusiasts kind of just, you know, fall back into hobbyists and never go anywhere. Anyway, that's what I think about all the time, every time we talk about WoW Classic.
No, I mean, it's a good point. I was actually messing with one recently called Turtle WoW, and I don't know why it's called Turtle WoW, but they took the classic version and they've just added like new races, new zones. They're working on dungeons and raids. Like, I mean, it truly is like a fan mod of World of Warcraft at this point. And it has all the things that you loved about it plus more, which is, I think, what some people wanted out of Classic. We didn't really get that. Instead, we just got every expansion released as Classic, but I'm getting ahead of myself there. So they end up getting, Blizzard brings in the Stallarius devs to Blizzard. They have a meeting and they basically announce like, hey, we're meeting with these guys and we're coming up with a plan because we hear you. Like, we hear you. And in a moment of just like perfect I told you so, J. Allen Brack has to get up on stage at a BlizzCon and he gives this stupid speech about how like, you know, I really like ice cream. It's one of my favorite desserts. Now, personally, I really like chocolate, but I hear some of you really like vanilla. And the whole crowd just fucking erupts because they know exactly what's coming. Because, you know, the regular WoW was always referred to as vanilla WoW, right? So, and some people will distinguish. Vanilla WoW was literally like the original version. And then Classic is like the recreation of it, right? But, so they announced that. WoW Classic comes up. The executives basically all thought like, hey, this will be a pretty cool revenue bump for this year. But for the most part, we don't really expect people to stick around. And they were absolutely shocked that people stuck around like crazy to the point where John Haidt, you know, I mentioned this earlier, he says, hey, I think we actually have the two biggest MMOs on the planet right now, World of Warcraft and old World of Warcraft.
Which is just so endlessly funny to me. That, you know, they launched the same game twice and just drastically underestimated the appeal both times.
It's true. Both times they released World of Warcraft, they're like, nobody wants this. not the extent that we think they will, you know?
Yeah, there's only two games I've ever played that have made me sit in like a digital queue to sign on, and it is World of Warcraft and Fortnite.
I thought you were going to say World of Warcraft and World of Warcraft Classic. There's not a whole lot more to say about this, except I do think a couple things are interesting in that this whole idea, I think, really gives them some ideas of what to do with their franchises. So you end up getting the StarCraft remastered, right? You get, you know, we were just playing classic Overwatch the other day. They did a Warcraft 3 re-release that we'll get to in a minute because it fucking tanked. But the whole idea is, I think they really bought into this. Like, hey, actually, there are a lot of people who just want to re-experience like the old game with just a few modern tweaks to make it a little more accessible. But for the most part, we want the same game we were playing. We just want to be able to play it again. And this has taken the form of them releasing every expansion as classic. It's taken the form of them doing something called Season of Discovery, which is regular WoW in seasons. In each season, they throw in a few tweaks here and there. Like one of them is, so I was playing this, I'm a warrior. I find a pair of boots that has a mage blink on it. And now if I have that pair of boots, I can use a mage skill as a warrior. And I thought that was really cool. And then now they have the remix thing I was talking about before the podcast, where they're kind of like an accelerated limited time event of a certain expansion. They've really, I think they've really taken the success of Classic and kind of used that to mold their philosophy about like revisiting their old games, especially in something like World of Warcraft, where the vast majority of their expansions are content that is dead and useless and obsolete the second the new one comes out. So now they're getting to retread that, and going forward, their last couple of expansions have introduced a lot more features that you would call evergreen that are always going to be part of World of Warcraft. So I really do think Classic is like, even though it's kind of a footnote in some ways, it has really kind of informed their philosophy going forward.
The nature of live service games, especially in our modern era, is just like those games go away. I mean, we saw it with Overwatch, which I know we'll talk about at another time, but like that game, the original Overwatch, no longer exists. There is no way to play it, much like with WoW. Like, you cannot play the original version of that game. So it makes sense to both relive those memories, but also let people who have gotten into this game way later be able to see what it was like in the beginning. Like, this is what you missed. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing, but now you get to see it. And I think that is a cool thing that they've done. And it's surprising that they would be so adamant that people don't want that whenever it was first brought up to them.
Yeah, that part does tickle me. Just truly not learning your lesson.
I am very excited to see companies revisiting their old titles and proving out this model of like updating older games is a profitable model. Because, nothing is kind of sadder than seeing something that you used to spend a lot of time on and it's just literally not available to you anymore. Like, you can never have that kind of experience again. So I will always root for any company that's willing to take their old stuff and make it new. And this is also a totally separate podcast, but Age of Empires 2,
yes,
another really good example of doing that. And I can't believe it's 2024 and I'm still buying Age of Empires content. But this is a podcast about Blizzard.
Last thing about Classic I will say is that one of the things the player base was really looking forward to is they were like, oh yeah, like those raids, those were hard. Those old raids, bro, Molten Core, Onyxia, that kicked your ass. Dude, it was like 4 players dressed in level 58 blues beat a 40-man raid by themselves in the first 2 weeks. It turns out that the game wasn't hard. We were just dumb and had dial-up internet, right? It turns out so much of the difficulty involved getting 40 people together, which now, after the first game, they went down to 25, right? You never did 40-man raids again after vanilla. Part of it was getting that many people together. Part of it was getting people's connections to behave. And then another part was just like that institutional knowledge of the player base that builds over time. By the time Classic came out, I mean, people had spreadsheets showing the most efficient builds for like feral druids, like DPS druids that literally weren't a thing in vanilla, because if you were a druid, you healed and that's all you did. Now people are like, no, if I take this random trinket from this low level dungeon and use this one weird build and spam these collectible items from a starter zone, I can get unlimited energy and cat form my whole way through. It's like, who's fucking doing this? But the answer is like all of the weirdos who are obsessed with Classic. And I think, Classic is one that they screwed it up at first, but it has since been a huge success for them. Some of these things we're to get to later. I don't know if you can say that they ever came around to being successes, unfortunately.
Are we talking about Reforged?
We may as well talk about Reforged. So, Jeff, you played Warcraft 3, correct? The campaign?
I did. I played both the base game and is it the Frozen Throne?
Yes. So this was a huge part of my like early gaming childhood. I loved the campaigns. I loved the mechanics. I loved RTS. I was like, why would I ever play StarCraft or Age of Empires again when I can play Warcraft?
Oh man, so many reasons.
So the story really starts with a guy named Rob Breidenbecker, and he worked in Blizzard's QA department in like 95, and he kind of made a name for himself by handling all the shit no one wanted to do, such as like messing with the BattleNet billing system. And around 2015, 2016, he finds himself in charge of their Apple division. Well, they're not porting anything to Mac this year. So he has this whole staff that has nothing to do. And one of them is messing around remaking StarCraft in the StarCraft 2 engine. And he gets the idea, hey, we should just release a remastered version of StarCraft, right? It's not going to be new mechanics or anything like that, but it's going to be high def textures. You'll be able to do widescreen, just make it a modern version. It's pretty successful.
Absolutely incredible decision. Yeah. Like just chef's kiss. Perfect.
I think it's got that thing where you can at any point, kind of like the Master Chief Collection, just switch back and forth between the old and new textures.
That is super cool. Talk about grounding your nostalgia there.
So you can literally be like, was I crazy with a button press? Like, no, okay, it did look like ass. Gotcha.
It's so funny. I'm getting off on a tangent here, but it's so funny to like play these remastered games, right? And be like, yeah, this is exactly how it was, back in 2002 or whatever, and then flip over to the actual 2002 version and be like, how the fuck did I ever get this?
I definitely had that experience playing the Master Chief Collection, so I know what you mean.
You're sitting there and you're like, this is absolute garbage. God, I guess that was a boring time in my life. But, no, it's just, once you've seen new stuff, it's very hard to go back.
They recently announced a Warcraft battle chest where they're remastering Warcraft 1 and 2. And one of the quality of life features is the ability to drag a box around the units you want to select.
Oh
my God. That wasn't a thing in Warcraft 2, which I actually played a couple of years ago. And yeah, you have to hold down shift and click all of them individually. It's pretty fascinating. But so StarCraft Remastered comes out. It's a pretty good success. But internally, there's a little skepticism from the staff. Like some of the staff was complaining like these timelines are really poorly managed. We had really long hours. And being this like weird offshoot classic team, we didn't have the manpower. And one of them ends up saying, quote, I think when you succeed by doing the wrong thing, that can be even more dangerous than when you fail, which was a completely prescient, foreboding comment about what is to come.
That quote did stick out to me.
So he's like, hey, let's do Warcraft 3 next. And you know what? We're going to go bigger and badder because it's interesting, right? They're making so much money from World of Warcraft in China and all these other things in China. Warcraft 3 never got released in China because the government at the time like censored it and it just never got a real release there. So they're like, dude, if we re-release this, not only will we get all the money from the West, but we'll get it, all that first time Chinese money to people who never got to play it. It'll be fantastic. So they come up with this really ambitious plan where they're rewriting the game script to bridge some of the like the dialogue script to bridge some of these lore inconsistencies. They're hiring outside writers and animators. Austin, I know you're familiar with Christy Golden. They end up bringing her in to rewrite some of the story. I did
not know that.
Yeah, they're getting in some of the old level designers to come back and redo these. So it's like this huge project. And so their first pitch with it is they make a vertical slice for a mission called the Culling of Stratholme, which Drasher, that's like an iconic mission in that game.
That map is burned into my head, right? It's the moment when you realize that like Warcraft 3 is not an RTS game. It's almost like an RPG. Is a story that you are playing out. It's incredible.
Yeah, I have notes in here. So Austin, since you're not really familiar with it, this is the moment that's the equivalent of Anakin's not just the men, but the women and the children too.
Okay, all right.
This is that moment in his downfall, right?
Okay, got it. So it's like the first. It's the first sign. Got it. The first big sign.
It's the point of no return, is what I would say.
Right, it's the point of no return. It's really when he walks into the Jedi temple rooms, stares at the youngling, and ignites.
There you go. Maybe that's the better comparison. Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's less than the first sign. Then that's like okay, you're done. It's over.
And so they have this ambitious plan. They're gonna make the camera angle be all cinematic. They end up wanting to, back in the day, Warcraft 3, the characters' mouths were just little flaps that went up and down, but they want to do like motion cap for the mouths, and they're just totally going to redo it.
Yeah, they are making a new game at this point.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic vertical slice. The problem was it took months and months, and Bryden Becker, maybe because he didn't learn his lessons with StarCraft Remastered, he's like, hey, we're still going to hit these deadlines, no problems. Even though the staff
are
like,
wrong lessons.
It took us 3 months to make one mission. There's like 12 missions for each of the 4 factions in this game. But I think in the book it mentions that there's just this internal optimism where they're like, hey, I lead with positivity and we're going to get this game done and we're going to have our Blizzard magic. And people basically were just putting their heads in the sand until it became very apparent that, oh my God, we're never going to be able to do this.
So when they finally released Reforged, how did it do?
It went pretty poorly. It actually has one of their worst Metacritic ratings of all time. I think the worst, actually. And a large portion of that is because not only did they end up having to cut a lot of those single player changes that they wanted to make. So, I mean, I think even like months after the game released on the website, it still said like fully redone cinematics. No.
Like they were not
rewritten story and stuff.
No.
All these things just, I mean, at that point it's like false advertising, right? I mean, just totally fucking not in the game. But beyond that, they had to remove core multiplayer features. They didn't have time to like get them in the new version. So on the time the game launches, there's no automated tournaments, which the original version of Warcraft 3 had. There's no like proper matchmaking system. There's like no competitive ladder. And the worst part is it was like it pulled an Overwatch. You can't play the original Warcraft 3 online anymore with Blizzard servers. You have to play the Reforged version. Their first tournament, the game crashes twice. And the whole crowd starts chanting, "We want LAN. We want LAN."
Yes, I will also always champion local multiplayer protests.
Just
incredible.
A total disaster of a release. And they come out with all these announcements like, oh, we're going to do this and that. We're going to fix it up. Never really happens. It really wasn't until this past week they actually announced, hey, Reforged 2.0 is coming. And what that basically means is we're just giving it the remastered treatment of the other games and calling it a day.
What it was supposed to be.
Don't worry, y'all. We have
not even what it was supposed to be.
We have Reforged, the Reforged, so you're good now.
Yeah, so all of the, I think since they already made them, all of the new textures are in the game, but you can switch between original, remastered, and then the Reforged textures. They're all like 3 different things.
That's why do I need that? But go ahead.
Well, in the settings, you can apparently customize them per unit in building too. So if you really like the new Arthas, you can keep him, but then keep like the old Illidan or whatever. So that's kind of interesting. But they have basically announced like, oh yeah, that original plan for Reforged gone forever. For sure.
Never going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, and that pretty much, right? I mean, this experience with Reforged is pretty much what killed real-time strategy development for Blizzard for the first time ever in its history. Like, there was no RTS being worked on at all.
And I mean, that's just what's so interesting about watching a company like this grow and change throughout the eras of gaming, right? Like, again, Blizzard is the RTS company to me. It created StarCraft, the national sport of Korea, for a decade or two. And now they don't even do the genre anymore. Meanwhile, I know it exists. So,
yeah, I think one of the sadder parts of this is, I forget his name, Tim Means, something like that. He was one of the heads.
Tim Morton.
Yeah, Tim Morton, heads of StarCraft 2. He was so banking on Reforged being a success because then he might finally be able to make another RTS. He was like, first I was hopeful for Warcraft 4, then Reforged failed, and I was like, okay, what about a StarCraft 3? Oh no, you completely shut down the StarCraft 2 team? Okay, good sign. What about a Call of Duty RTS?
Yes, let's point out this man was so desperate he was willing to take on the Call of Duty IP. So
isn't that essentially just like a freaking like Command and Conquer? Like,
I don't know. It was just
like, is that just like full circle? Like,
maybe so. And so he ends up leaving the company to make Frost Giant Studios, I think is what they're called. Frost something Studios. They've just recently released a new RTS. I hate that I don't remember the name of it because I was just playing it last month, but unfortunately it is that forgettable. But
that's unfortunate.
Well, part of it is because it's a free-to-play game where they want to charge you for the campaign. And so the first 3 missions are free. And then they were like, well, it's like $12 for the rest of the campaign, which like in a vacuum isn't that bad, right? I like to play the campaigns. I'll pay $12 for the campaign, but there's just something weird about the game letting me in and then saying, hold up, give me more money for what you actually want to play. Even though at the end of the day, it's not that bad of a value. There's just something about it that I really didn't like the feeling of. And so I haven't bought it.
It's called Stormgate. Yeah.
Yes, Stormgate.
I remember seeing this one at one of the somethings, right? Summer Games Fest, something. I saw trailers for it and thought it looked interesting, and then it completely fell off my radar. I didn't realize it was this guy.
Actually, it does look.
That's interesting.
It does look super cool. I might download this later.
It might even.
We're all coming out of this podcast like, maybe we're all gonna get Stormgate.
Part of the problem is, how the first like 3 missions of an RTS campaign are, right? So only getting those 3 was kind of like blue balls in that campaign.
Right.
I didn't actually get to do interesting. I learned how to make someone do work.
Yeah. So that's kind of the story of Reforged. It really never came back around to getting a great release. People still pan it all the time. It was, it got rid of the original Warcraft 3 servers. I think it's fair to say that of everything they've released, this might be the worst regarded of any of them.
Yeah, and it might be because because it came so late in Blizzard's history. It's not like this is their first major failure. In fact, much later we'll talk about like what was their first like real big failure, but that never saw the light of day, right? This is the first time where they have seriously messed up, and then they pushed it out anyway.
Yeah, because it's not like Blizzard hadn't canceled plenty of projects, right? And we'll talk about that at some point too. But that was the thing, is they were kind of good at knowing what shouldn't be released. And this coming from a longtime veteran Warcraft developer who'd been at the company since the 90s that everyone trusted, and it just being released as like a steaming pile of shit, definitely I think was really, that was I think where Blizzard's reputation really started to take hits, and it kind of sets up some of their later failures to crack the armor even further, you know? Mm-hmm. One of those, if we want to go ahead and move on, was Diablo Immortal. And this isn't a very
about this.
Don't you guys have phones?
You know,
this isn't a very long one, but boy, is it funny.
You know, to their credit, Blizzard is always able to like, you know, really generate the meme culture, right? I think.
I'd say that if nothing else, there will be memes.
Intentional or otherwise. So, you know, BlizzCon 2018 rolls around, and Morhaime is retiring, and he's going to be announcing it there. And they want to have something to pair with that is not imminently depressing, right? Mm-hmm. So they're like, hey, we should announce Diablo 4. But the director, Louis Barriga, who I think is actually one of the guys who'd end up being fired after the lawsuit later, so his name will come up again. But he's basically like, no, like I really don't think that we should tease this yet because it's just not ready. And it's not really like my team's fault that marketing hasn't figured out how this convention's going to work. You know, I don't think this would be fair to me and my team. And so then they're saying, okay, what if we announce this mobile project we've been working on with NetEase, which is like one of the partners that they use to release all their games in China. And it's called Diablo Immortal, and it's going to be a mobile version of Diablo. So they're definitely a little worried about announcing it on their own, which is why they keep trying to get the Diablo 4 thing in. But eventually they're like, okay, we'll just let one of the founders of the company kind of explain what's going on, which at this point is just Adam, because Morhaime's left, right? So he writes this blog post, and he's like, hey guys, we have a lot of Diablo projects in the work. And he makes this quip that's like, good things come to those who wait, but evil things often take even longer. So he's really hyping up Diablo, but he's like, but I want you to know, we're not announcing main projects, but we do have some Diablo related news. Now, this was probably the worst thing they could have done. They should have said nothing, because all this did was send the fans into like a speculative frenzy, right?
Yeah, this is also a prime example of like corporate compromise, right? Like people trying to still sort of meet expectations, be able to say that they like did a thing. We announced new Diablo stuff. We have Diablo stuff to announce at BlizzCon or whatever. Check mark, that was my job and I've gotten it done. But it's like they lose sight. No one in the room really had a good understanding of like what they were about to do. To all of us on the outside, like, oh, this is fucking obvious. How did you not think about this? And it's just sort of an example of what happens as a company gets bigger, as people get specialized in roles, and as story developers don't have the right people sitting next to them being like, what are you fucking doing? Like, no, do not say this.
Yeah, so they announced this at Blizzard, and the room is kind of like scattered applause and like murmuring. People are like, oh. So, you know, they immediately have a Q&A, and one guy gets up there and he's like, is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke? And this poor bastard, Wyatt Chang, right? So he's actually been a Diablo designer for a long time, going all the way back to the Blizzard North days. But he's not necessarily one of the faces of the company, so a lot of people just don't necessarily know who he is. And he ends up really becoming the face of Immortal, which is just so unfortunate for a guy who's poured his heart and soul in this entire franchise for decades, right? And but the biggest blunder is when someone says, do you guys plan on at least releasing this for PC so we can play it on, you know, battle.net and our computers and everything? And the guy says, no, we have no plans for that. And the whole crowd just groans. And he says, what, do you guys not have phones? And which I thought was kind of funny, personally. The fans did not.
So that's the thing, right? It's a funny quip because, of course, everyone has like smartphones and stuff, right? And clearly the guy is on stage just like kind of trying to
damage
save.
Control.
Yeah. And
he's salvaging this announcement that he knows they probably shouldn't have made.
That he probably didn't want to make.
Yeah.
Right.
The poor guy is just digging himself a hole. So go watch it sometimes, y'all. And it's a good exercise in like how a crowd will turn on you, and you know, knowing when to just shut the fuck up and leave, honestly. So.
Yeah,
but I mean, it's crazy to think about. Like, this is a crowd of people who paid entirely to see one company do the thing that they do, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like they're at like a Comic-Con where it's got people from all different walks of life and all different like parts of entertainment culture. Like, these are all people who are invested in Blizzard and are diehard Blizzard fans to the point where they would pay to go to a Blizzard convention in California. And even they're like, boo.
Yeah.
Like, that's how you know you messed up.
And ultimately, this would not be a Reforged level debacle because they do end up making a version for PC. So when the game finally does come out, it comes out on phones and PC at the same time. Diablo 4 gets announced like the next year. So it was a big blunder, but I think ultimately, you know, Diablo 4 still comes out a couple years later. They make it for PC. Most people really don't care all that much about the phone game to begin with. So I think there's no real expectations for it not to hit. And I think this is something that, while it was a big deal in the moment, I think it's kind of sort of quieted down and people don't really see Immortal as a big deal compared to, say, like Reforged.
Yeah, I had honestly completely forgotten about it until I read it in the book.
Well, it also helped that the game wasn't that bad. Like,
Yeah.
it's not great, obviously, but it's just phone Diablo, which is like probably not the way that you want to experience Diablo, but it's okay. Like, I played it for 2 or 3 hours. I was like, yeah, this is fine.
I'm sorry.
It wasn't like offensively
It's
bad.
still a mobile game, right?
Yeah, so it plays a lot like Diablo, but then, you know, all of those systems around it are very mobile-y. Yeah.
Yeah, no, all right. That's
Yeah,
just...
I mean, it definitely still feels like a mobile game, but like it plays like a Diablo game. So it's like at least the gameplay itself is fun enough.
I'm just...
Whenever you are playing it.
It's probably the only way you can fight Satan from your toilet. So that's
There
the
you-
upside.
Yes,
But, you know.
exactly.
Look,
Unless you like bring your laptop in there, which sounds terrible.
I will also never miss an opportunity to hate on mobile gaming, so I'm just going to be offended by default. So moving on.
You and me both.
That is also fair.
So not...
I don't want to hear it from you, Adam.
All right, listen.
How much money have you put into Galaxy of Heroes?
That was like 5 years ago, and I got a smartphone for like the first time in my life. All right, I was in a bad place.
I was in a bad place.
The answer is like $220.
The only real way to explain a mobile gaming addiction. I was not in a good place in my life. It was a hard time.
I just started my real career, and some reason that was the worst part of my life. I don't know. It was
Adam had new money. So.
that's really
I'd
what
say
it was.
he had money to blow, so he just blew it on.
I was living in
on
like
Galaxy
a
of Heroes.
roach-ridden studio apartment for the last like 3 years. Got my first paycheck and was like, oh, I can buy all the little fucking purple crystals I want.
I mean, hey, you know what? Valid.
So that's not a whole lot more to say about Immortal. Another blunder that I think is fun to talk about is the whole Blitzchung saga. You guys remember this one?
Yep, also related to BlizzCon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is the political statement fiasco, yeah.
So there was a gentleman by the name of Niwai Chung, and he was a professional Hearthstone player. He had really gotten very good at the game. He was kind of surprised himself because it wasn't really his type of game at first, but he ends up being really good at it, and he's winning these tournaments. And so, you know, there is, at the time of this Hearthstone tournament going on, there are some big protests going on in Hong Kong. And I don't want to say at the time, like, they're not probably still ongoing in some capacity, but he is on a live stream of the game, obviously, and he's being interviewed afterwards by these two broadcasters, and this is their Chinese stream, right? And he just says in Mandarin, like, liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times. And he puts on like a mask when he does it, like the gas mask, because I think that was kind of like the symbol of protest, right? And the two announcers immediately like duck under the table, like they were worried about the CCP headshotting them or something. And I mean, they're just immediately like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. And so Blizzard comes out, and the book kind of gets into it a little bit of detail. They're like, you know, look, ultimately we do have a policy here. And while we sympathize with this particular case, the reason we have this policy is because if you think about the last few years, right? The last thing we need is someone being like MAGA in the middle of one of our tournaments, right? So that's kind of their policy here. So they're thinking to themselves, okay, we're going to treat this as we would any other political statement. We're not going to play favorites. We're suspending this guy for a year, and we're taking back his prize money as per the agreement that he signed. But just because he signed an agreement doesn't mean it's anything people didn't still hate, right? So the players are immediately furious about this. They're like, really, dude? Like, this guy is, you know, making a real important statement. You have a platform for this. This guy still won the damn tournament. You're really going to take away his money and his ability to compete? I mean, he said how depressed he was in the book because he's like, this is my life, Hearthstone. That's all I do is play Hearthstone. And now it's just gone. It became such a thing that I want to say it was like, I can't remember who from the Republican Party, but some Republican senator and AOC both released a joint statement that's basically like, Blizzard, like, you have an opportunity to really be like a force of good in the world and to highlight, the freedom that a democracy can have and blah, 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 blah. People are like, oh my God, did like two politicians in America agree on something? This is...
If you can get AOC and any Republican to agree on something, like, whoa, you messed up.
If you're on the wrong side of a bipartisan issue, you have failed. Surrender immediately.
Yeah, pretty much. So Blizzard ends up kind of going back on this really quickly. They end up letting him keep the prize money, and they keep the ban to something like a 3 or 6 month ban. And they come out at BlizzCon the next year. J. Allen Brack, who is just always having to deliver the like foot and mouth speeches. Yeah. They don't directly admit fault. They don't really directly apologize, but they do say that they may be stuck to their policy a little too rigidly, and that they would reevaluate this going forward, but that they know actions speak louder than words. So they'll just have to let them actions speak for themselves, which I guess is their only choice. They didn't really say anything at all. And and that's kind of the end of that saga. But I do think that was one where the reputational hit was pretty big, because people were like, we already have started to view you as this kind of soulless corporation compared to, our childhood heroes. And now you go and sell out to like one of the biggest geopolitical rivals of our nation on the planet, and we're just not fans of that. And it really, was not a good look for Blizzard.
Look, it's just anytime you try to fall back on like a blanket policy or like a zero tolerance policy for different things, it's always going to be a losing battle. I mean, I don't exactly expect entertainment companies to employ the kind of like communication talents to smooth over like worldwide political revolutionary statements. Like, they're always going to be bad at this kind of thing, right? This is just not something Blizzard should specialize in. But I am, I am surprised at how poorly they handled it. And that just comes with the nature of being like mainstream media isn't the right word, but just like mainstream broad audience appeal.
I think that about wraps up the blunders of Blizzard that don't relate to keeping your hands to yourself. So
the biggest blunder.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we're gonna have to close this podcast out with just the most depressing part of this whole book, in my mind, is, and it may be like depressing. There might be other parts where, like, as a Blizzard fan, you are more personally depressed. But as far as the way, like, the empathy you feel for some of the people in this book, the 2 chapters called Boys Club and Reckoning, particularly Reckoning, are just, harrowing at times.
It's very... Okay, now I don't want to use the word impressive in this section at all, but it's like, it's just...
Probably not the right word choice.
I can't believe, going back to like the Boys Club section specifically, where they talk about the origins of what is legitimately a frat culture at Blizzard. The fact that that's able to like come together and put out anything good at all is impressive to me. As someone who's worked at a tech company with a frat culture, it's not typically the kind of environment that creative people excel in. It's usually awful. Don't get me wrong, I love having a keg at work, but like, you don't make money that way. You don't make good products that way.
See, I was going to ask, like, not to name the name of the company, but it was just the one you were working for when we lived together.
Yeah. This was the fintech company. Like, I've literally been the guy like changing the beer kegs at the office before, just to give you an idea of how incredibly privileged I am. Reading the Blizzard book gave me like flashbacks to being in that kind of culture where you have nothing but lots of immature dudes who think they're doing something really interesting and like really impressive. Working hard, getting drunk, and just generally being like early 20s like dicks to each other. In my personal experience, I was old enough to know that wasn't for me and very quickly moved on. And so it was not at all surprising for me to hear about how that sort of toxic culture evolved into some of the worst experiences you could have in corporate America.
Yeah, and the Boys Club chapter in particular just gets into, it's a little more lighthearted in that it's like they did a bunch of crazy things, but they don't get into any of the like just awful personal stuff for the most part. One of the crazy stories in that one is that they are in Las Vegas celebrating the launch of some game, and which they used to do with every release pretty much. And they're at this hotel, and 2 of the employees got super drunk, and they went into the bathroom of their room, and they threw up in the bathtub to the point where it clogged the drain, and then they left the shower running and then just drunkenly left, I guess. And it ends up flooding the whole first floor of this hotel. And Blizzard, like as a company, is just banned from the hotel. They're like, none of your employees will ever stay here under your name ever again.
The best part of that whole story to me is whenever it's like the employee in question basically says, in today's world, I would have been fired. But back then, reaction was, don't ever do that again. But that was really fucking funny. Yeah. And, like, that, he's exactly right. Like, there's no way that would ever happen now. No. And somebody not immediately be fired and, like, a bunch of statements come out and it should be, like, a whole thing.
Mm-hmm. It's like they knew that it was wrong, but they didn't really know why or the implications of it. It's like they were still growing.
Yeah, you know, look, you have to grow. It's okay.
But there's all kinds of crazy stories from these early days. There's a QA tester named Jason Hutchins, and he basically says, like, you would go into the bathroom, and it's basically like a boys' locker room, and there would just be, like, pornographic pictures on a bulletin board, and people were, like, voting which one they thought was the best. There was one employee that took down an Office server just trying to see how much porn he could put on it. And, you know, Bill Roper, I mentioned earlier, he basically says, like, to say the least, gender diversity was not something in our young to late 20s vocabulary. Yeah. It's a frat house, right?
It's a frat house. It's an extension of the seedier sides of the early 2000s internet, right? Like we were talking about how Blizzard was a culture maker on the internet with World of Warcraft. And of course, that comes with all of the internet culture, not just the stuff that they created.
Yeah. By 2000, they do have a few women in development. It's mostly art and QA roles. I think one of them even mentions that, like, she was there for a couple years before they even had bathrooms that weren't labeled men. Like,
yeah,
you know, they just kind of assumed women would never work for Blizzard, I guess. There was a marketing employee named Kathy Carter Humphreys, and she said, you know, I loved working there in the early days. Everyone treated me well. I don't really feel like I was abused or anything, but working with men in their 20s could be just immensely frustrating. And she tells a particular anecdote where, you know, there's the Marine on the front of StarCraft. And they kept sending her the art with a cigarette in his mouth. And she's like, dude, we can't do that. Like, places like Walmart will never carry this. You just need to take the cigarette out of his mouth. You can still have it in the game, the cutscenes, but not on the box art. And then they'd send it the night before. That is the deadline, with the cigarette still in it. And she's like, we had to just pay film houses to retouch some of the box art and just take out the shit that these literal children would not take out so we can market the goddamn game. Like,
which is unbelievable. I particularly like the anecdotes about literally like drunken brawls in the middle of the night, or like
Chris Metzen or actually like, getting knocked out.
I mean,
yeah, like, oh my god,
that is the impressive story, both for like dodging the assault charges and also not getting fired because the other guy in the fight with you is like critical to the company.
Right, it's just too important.
Yeah,
like they can't fire Chris, so they can't fire me.
Therefore, I am untouchable.
I guess if you're gonna fight with someone, let it be someone who's indispensable.
Correct. If you're gonna, yeah.
Well, the other crazy thing about all of this is the just number of like uncomfortable relationships that would end up forming out of like pretty much every Blizzard executive like being in a relationship or romantically involved with like lower level employees. It's just super weird.
Yeah, they mention Brevik, so from North, ends up dating a female programmer, which causes a lot of tension with the male programmers because they basically think she's being like fast tracked and treated unfairly, and like treated, you know, they're being treated unfairly, I guess is the way they interpreted it. The COO would marry the head of PR, which just sounds like a great fucking scenario.
Awesome, perfect.
There was one tech support worker who got engaged to one of his employees, or a Blizzard employee, and then later ends up marrying an entirely different Blizzard employee. I think it's just a story of a lot of these, especially in the early days, these guys didn't do anything else. They came to work and they went home. And so their whole life is Blizzard, and there's nowhere else they're going to meet people. And the poor handful of women there are just getting constantly hit on and approached because like that's the only place these guys ever meet women.
Right. There was another story about one of the, I guess it was a tech or something, a tester who would like just get hit on all the time. They found out that like she wasn't single,
Yeah.
and it was like, oh, well, never mind. We're just not going to talk to you anymore.
yeah.
And it's like, oh my God.
Some of the real dredges of society there. Like, folks, if you think your only dating pool is at work, you need to make adjustments in your life.
Yes.
Stop working as much is really what it
you need to
boils
do
down
something.
to.
You are going down the wrong path. Like,
Find a hobby. Like,
no hate to people who genuinely find their partner in like a professional scenario, but like,
Sure.
this is a story about what happens when your life is totally consumed by one group of people, and it's usually not good.
and it just puts people in uncomfortable situations all around. Like, there's executives that now have to like answer to the fact that they're dating their subordinates, and it's just uncomfortable for the subordinate because everyone's looking at them like, oh, you get special treatment now. Like, it's just all around not a good situation. That's why most companies forbid it.
And don't get me wrong, the situation being poor is like no excuse for anyone who ever engages in like harassment. But like at the same time, like, come on, y'all, have more self-awareness than this.
Yeah, and at least a lot of this stuff in these early days appeared to be consensual all around. Like, the book even says, like, at least all of this stuff was consensual, and it was just uncomfortable.
Yeah, you know, there's one woman in here, Melissa Edwards, who basically says like, it was definitely a bro culture, but I had a great time. I enjoyed it. I didn't think it was too crazy. And I don't know how long she was there and when she was there, but like, I do have to imagine that it just probably varied a lot person to person, you know, just who you interacted with, what was the context. Because I think once we get into that next chapter, Reckoning, that's when you really start to see that, like, as the company grew, some of the rockstar designers and developers just began to wield their influence in very, very questionable ways.
Questionable is an understatement. You know, like when the state of California decides to get involved, like, again,
Yeah.
I think we've crossed over questionable.
I mean, I do want to be clear that I don't think there were any, at least not in Blizzard. So there was stuff on the Activision side. I remember that reading that was a lot worse. Like, that wasn't even in this book because it didn't pertain to Blizzard itself. But there was like a woman who had naked pictures of herself like passed around the company, and then is like bullied for it on a work retreat. And then like goes home and kills herself.
oh, what the fuck? I missed that part.
Yeah. So that I remember reading in the actual like lawsuit part.
I think that's in the Activision side.
Yeah, that
right?
wasn't in
Like, that was
the
on the
Blizzard
Blizzard side, right?
But there was definitely some stuff going on. And one of the things that was crazy to me about the Blizzard side of it is that there was one particular guy who kind of became the center point of things. Now, the women had what they called the Whisper Network, right? And so basically the idea was that, like, they couldn't necessarily get HR to do anything about some of these guys because they weren't necessarily like breaking rules because it was off site or whatever else. You know, I'm sure it was a lot of lame excuses, but so they decided, okay, basically when new women join, we're just going to let them know, like, hey, that guy over there, like, just watch out for him. Like, he's kind of a creep.
Oh my God.
And it turns out that one Alex Afriasabi was the what I think Jason Schrier refers to as like a rock star of the the Whisper Network.
The absolute worst description you could be.
Yeah, not what you want to be recognized for more than anything else. And it's a shame too, because what basically happened is that he was so good at the WoW edit tools. Like, that's what the book says, is like the executives would kind of look the other way with some of his behavior because he could just do things with the tools that no one else could, or at a speed no one else could. And that really allowed him to rise up through the company. And man, he just uses it to do some of the creepiest stuff. Austin, do you remember any particular creeper story about Alex that you would like to tell?
You know, I think let me see if I remember the one. It has to do with the infamous Cosby room.
Yes.
Oh, God. Oh, that is a combination. Man, what a weird story. A combination of like poor timing and also genuine awfulness. That's so strange.
Yeah.
The book does make it clear that the Cosby room was named the
Right.
Cosby room because of the way his sweater looked like the carpet.
It was
and that
before-
as soon as all that news came
the-
out, they even stopped calling it the Cosby room.
Yeah, it was before justice came for Bill Cosby, but like, Jesus Christ.
But it's just like you can't get around the fact that it was in fact called the Cosby room, and things that were happening in the Cosby room were
Not okay.
not often great.
Again, the ultimate crossover episode, folks. Blizzard Entertainment.
So I think what you're really referring to is the whole incident with this woman named Michelle Morrow, right? So she's an actress and a writer, and she is friends with a designer for World of Warcraft named Dave Kosak. And she's at dinner with him and his wife, Crystal. And they're just, they're friends. They're having a good dinner. And during the meal, this man staggers up and he's just fucking trashed, right? The way she describes it is, he was super wasted and he was hitting on me with wild abandon, saying ridiculous, embarrassing things, such as like, he told me if I married him, I'd have the keys to Blizzard, whatever the fuck that means. which cracked me up reading that, even though this is not a funny situation. But
no, but Mora's description of it,
you can just feel how flabbergasted she is at this whole situation. Right. I mean, the dude is just sloppy drunk. And so so Dave Kozak, he ends up like walking him away from the table, apologizing. He's like, dude, my boss is just something else. But like he diffuses the situation. But a mistake he makes, which isn't really in the moment a mistake, but would come back to ruin his entire life, is when they're headed up to the Cosby room, he texts the people there saying he's coming, saying, hey, I got hot chicks ready for the cause, which was a total joke because he was talking about his wife and her friend. They're like with him, and they're just basically saying, hey, I'm on the way to the room. Yeah. As it comes out that this Alex dude is a creep, he, there's that clip of him at a BlizzCon where this girl walks up and says like, hey, I'm really into this game, but I was just kind of wondering, do you ever plan on making any armor for females that aren't taken straight out of a Victoria's Secret catalog? And his response is like, well, what catalog do you want us to take their armor out of?
Oh my God.
And I mean, just so dismissive, so inappropriate. And he's supposed to be like the leader up on that stage. He's running this panel. And there's just so many instances of him doing weird stuff. But unfortunately, from the situation I was describing, Mr. Kosak ends up getting wrapped into this in a way he really wasn't involved, right? So when Kotaku, which is actually where Jason Schrier used to work, covers this lawsuit, the person who writes it, his name was Ethan Gach, and he ends up just kind of going into some of their Facebooks and pulling out some of these pictures and things and showing some of these things out of context. And one of the things he gets is a picture of a text of him, of Kosak saying this, right? I have the hot chicks for the cause. The internet, in a moment of like, not to make this too political, but how there's normally that kind of like very right-leaning youth, angry side of gamers who are normally all like, we're not going to cancel culture, blah, 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 blah. Well, they go straight to canceling this guy, right? Because they're mad at Blizzard because Blizzard released a bad game, so now we need to ruin lives, which is kind of the capital G gamer way of life. So they go after this guy. At this point, he's not even working at Blizzard, but he gets fired from his job because their quote-unquote teammates are uncomfortable with him. And I'm going to get up on my righteous horse for a second. Fuck that person. Okay, listen. If you have a problem with your teammate because of an internet rumor, go talk to them. Just go talk to them. Do not go straight to HR and get this man fired because of an internet rumor. Like, this is ridiculous.
Well, especially whenever, after all the investigations and everything, basically turned him up like clean.
His name is not in the lawsuit. Like, he is not mentioned.
Right. Like they figure out that he is not really part of the problem. It was other people, and that sucks in this when innocent people got roped up in something that was legitimately a very gross like thing that was happening at Blizzard.
It wasn't like someone found an old newspaper clipping where this guy got arrested for like child endangerment or something, right? I mean, it was truly an internet rumor, and that's just unfortunate. But it's like you said earlier, Jeff. It really was a combination of like bad timing and other crazy things that just blew this whole situation up. I don't want to say out of proportion, but into the public eye.
I mean, it's just not surprising when part of your core culture is being a fraternity house that it evolves into ways that legitimately harms people's lives. And like, I don't know, as incredible as certain creative achievements are, it's not ever a justification for building a culture where people get hurt.
I was just saying another big thing that came out of all this, more tied to the games of Blizzard, is kind of the massive effort to remove them all from, like, move references from these people in the games. Like Jesse McCree from Overwatch being like his name being changed to Cassidy because there's a real person named Jesse McCree who worked at Blizzard who did some gross stuff, and like, Blizzard took things seriously and they made an effort to fix some of these wrongs. But
yeah, we don't know a lot of the details. Like, so Blizzard had fired Afrasabi like a year and a half before this lawsuit was public, and his team was just never even informed why, right? He was actually on a God of War clone that starred Thrall. So they were going to make like a action adventure game like the new God of Wars. and he was leading up this project. And one day their bosses just come in and are like, Alex is no longer with the company. And they're like, okay, well, that's kind of crazy. Why? They don't say anything about it. And then like a week later, the project just gets shut down and they get moved on to other teams. And no one really knew what happened until the lawsuit came out.
So, right. And then it was like, oh, that's what happened.
And then you have two guys. So it was Jesse McCree and was it Louis Barriga, the Diablo 4 guy? I think?
Yeah.
So those two guys are fired after it comes out for what Blizzard called numerous HR complaints. There's one more guy. Oh, it was the CTO. We should talk about the crazy tech department because this sounds a lot like that company you worked for, Jeff, where there's just like a full bar in the tech department. Like,
this is like the IT team at a tech company, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, that's going to be a bad time.
So, one of the things the book talks about is Blizzard had sort of a potluck tradition that they called cube crawls, and you would just go to different cubes in your department, bring food from home, you'd all share it, hang out, have a few drinks. Well, the tech department in particular was just sloppy. Like people like throwing up in cubes, drinking all day long. Like this is the one that the lawsuit actually describes. And Jason Schrier has to kind of clarify, like, no, overwhelmingly, the cube crawls were totally innocent. But in this particular department, it was debauchery.
Yeah. That's why you can't have nice things, because some people take things too far. Yeah.
And something I do want to point out with all of this is that, kind of like we mentioned earlier, Mike Morhaime is pretty much clean in all of this. I know some people accused him of like, how did you not know this was going on? Like you should have maybe been more aware that this stuff was happening under your nose. But for the most part, it seems like everybody who had anything to say about him was very positive about, especially how he acted after all this came out. He put out a statement, I think it was on Twitter or just on the internet in general, I guess, where he reached out to everybody 3 years after he had already left the company and basically said, it's my responsibility. Like, I should have been stamping out the toxicity and harassment. Like, I'm sorry to all the Blizzard women. And I think he actually, like, took a lot of their complaints and stuff. Like he reached out and asked for feedback from people that had worked with him before.
Yeah, the book basically says that he sat on Zoom calls all afternoon listening to employee testimonies and stuff.
Which is awesome for a guy who wasn't at the company and had no obligation.
He's in the middle of running his own studio at that point, and he does way more than the Activision leadership does. I'll just say that.
Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, again, Activision. Yeah. We're not going to get into that right now, but
that's for next episode.
Your expectations for Activision should be absolutely underground. But yes, Mike taking active steps to mitigate the situation is something that should be commended, but at the same time, it's like the least he could do, right? Like the guy on top of a huge company comes out and like tries to mitigate the fact that his ship actually hurt a lot of people. Like, yeah, like you should do that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why he says it the way he does, I think, because he knows that like it isn't an excuse to just say you didn't know about it. Like, and maybe he didn't, but ultimately it doesn't matter, I guess, because he was still the captain of the ship. Yeah.
Maybe he didn't know about it, but he should have known about it if he didn't. Like,
well, so what Activision does is they first give like this PR apology thing. And what's really funny about it is the woman who writes it, like the head of PR, has only worked there like 4 or 5 months. And she has a statement about like the Activision Blizzard I know would never allow such things to happen or something like that. And it's like, what are you talking about? You just got here.
Right. Like what Activision Blizzard are you talking about?
You know, the outside PR version of it, you know.
Right.
So J. Allen Brack has taken over as president after Morhaime leaves. He is put on the chopping block for this, for sure. He gets fired pretty soon after all this breaks out. I remember he even wrote this really cringe statement about how he had it's like his mother was a feminist and they had pictures of like Gloria Steinem on their walls in their home. And it's like, it was just awful.
Very, my best friend's a black guy type thing. Like,
yeah,
I was about to say that. That's just like, I know women. Like,
but so they end up going with a dual president structure. And one of them is they promote I think she was it Vicarious Visions? It was whoever was the studio that did the Tony Hawk remix for Activision.
Oh God, I forgot about that.
Vicarious.
Again, crossover.
That's Vicarious.
Vicarious.
Yeah. Okay. So they poach her from that and move her to co-head of Blizzard, I guess. And the whole thing is like, these two are going to be paid the same. Like, we're going to have a woman executive at Blizzard for the first time ever, yada, yada. Dude, it's unclear the timelines and exactly how long it took, but she was out of there pretty quick. And part of it was because a new allegation came out about Bobby Kotick himself. And now he had hid rape allegations from the board of Activision, which like is obviously an ethical no-no, but it's also like a corporate no-no, because when you hide things from the board will not be fucking happy about it. Although they weren't happy enough they weren't unhappy enough to get rid of him apparently. But yeah, so that's like, that starts to affect like investors and stuff. That's like a huge thing you don't do. You don't hide shit from the board. But I guess Kotick's like the Teflon guy, because nothing really happens to him too much during all this, unfortunately. He stays head of the company and everything, and it's not really until Phil Spencer calls him up and is like, "Hey, buddy, is your failing company for sale?" that he kind of faces, I would say, consequences. I mean, he still gets a huge cash out, but at least like he is sort of forced out of being the head of Activision anymore, because I think the PR hit is just too much for the company to withstand.
Yeah.
Oh, and one thing I want to say about the tech department earlier with Ben Kilgore. So he got fired in an email from Morhaime, and it was really crazy because it just basically said like he's no longer with the company. And no one had ever seen an email at Blizzard like that before. It was, there's usually a reason, or it's like, hey, so-and-so has worked on this for so long, we wish him the best. This was just like, attention to Blizzard employees, Ben Kilgore is no longer at the company, signed Mike Morhaime. And everyone's like, what the hell? And so at a later meeting, one of his previous lieutenants is basically talking about it. And he says, I don't know if you've ever heard that joke. That's like, don't sleep with your assistant. And if you do, don't stop sleeping with your assistant. Not the way to actually announce someone was fired for sleeping with their assistant. Not the choice of words.
He did.
And this guy does. And then, when the Blizzard employees are doing walkouts, they're actually kind of concerned because Mike Ybarra, the other president next to Jen O'Neill, turns out he knew a lot of these guys that came over from Xbox, and he knew some of the guys at Blizzard in the tech department. And so he is like kind of cozy with some of these dudes that are just saying and doing weird shit. So employees are like, how do we know that this guy is cut from the right cloth? He ends up not surviving the Xbox merger. It could be a little bit because of the bad look. Could be a little bit because he made enemies on his way out of Xbox, not realizing that they would be right behind him. But both of the co-presidents don't last. But I mean, Jen O'Neill's not there a year. Mike Ibarra's maybe there 2.5, 3. Now I think Holly Longdale is in charge of World of Warcraft, and they've just divided Blizzard up into franchises with heads.
Yeah, they're into like 4 teams now, right?
Yeah, and there's barely any. I think Chris Metzen ended up coming back, but beyond that, he is the only person still there that worked on like Warcraft 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. It really was, whether it was people wanting to get out or people being forced out. Old Blizzard at this point, after this lawsuit, is kind of just, it's not a thing anymore. And Jeff, I remember in our Discord discussions throughout this week, one of the things you mentioned that was really clear was like, at the end of the day, a company is just the people who work for it. Mm-hmm. And that, yeah, of course, Blizzard isn't the old Blizzard because it's literally not. Like, the people aren't there anymore.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I wish the book did a little bit better is to emphasize like what the typical tenure of like a Blizzard employee was, right? Because the book follows the company from the 2 founders all the way up to where it's hundreds, maybe thousands of employees after World of Warcraft. I'm not quite sure.
I think it said 3,000 at one point after around the time of WoW's peak. It was around 3,000.
Yeah, they go international at one point. They have like an office in Europe and stuff. And the story though largely is following like the big names that stuck with the company for a long time. What you don't get the greatest sense for, except perhaps in like the more negative sections, is the huge number of like testers and devs and artists that like revolved through the door. And what really kept like, I think what you can really tie the reputation of Blizzard to are these longtime employees. And by the end of the book, you're talking about none of them being there anymore.
Right.
All of them have gone off to make a game of their own that fails.
And on top of that, this whole time, people have been coming and going just generally. So when you have both the tenured big name folks gone and of course, the regular churn of regular employees, you can't really call it the same company.
Right, and not to spend too much time on Morhaime, because like one person a company does not make, or however that saying would go. But it really does feel like once he left, Blizzard lost a lot of its identity because it felt like he fought so hard to keep that identity.
Yeah.
And once he was gone and he left, his departure was very much because of differences with Activision and just not being able to feel like he could keep that spirit of Blizzard alive anymore. But it does feel like a lot of that Blizzard that created World of Warcraft and the Blizzard that created StarCraft, like that Blizzard was gone. And that's why he left. But it feels like nobody else could really recover that Blizzard.
Yeah, certainly. And that's what this book is so interesting, because it's so much about the confluence of things that produced these, sort of cultural phenomenons that we spent a lot of time interacting with, right? And, all things come to an end. And just because something has a brand name that's been around a long time doesn't mean it has any relation to the things that made it special to begin with.
Yeah, it's kind of a depressing note to end on, but it
So we should wrap this up with some of our favorite quips or moments from the book, or at least this portion of the episode.
I'm gonna go first in case you have mine. One of my favorite little quips and moments from the book is related to the original Warcraft. It really demonstrating the success of Blizzard after this game and kind of what this company started. And there was a helpline that you could call into if you needed help either with the game or just installing it or whatever. It was just a tech support line for Warcraft. And there's this one anecdote about a man who calls in asks about help with the game, but he catches the voicemail of this helpline, and you can hear him arguing with his wife in the background. And at one point, he says, let me just finish this game, referring to Warcraft. And the wife yells, "This game is the reason we don't have sex anymore." And this moment just lived on in Blizzard. The Office would play this little voicemail clip over the intercom for everyone to hear, just to reiterate how much success Warcraft was finding and how impactful that game was.
Blizzard, game's so good, we'll ruin your marriage. But yeah.
That has to be so validating as the people who worked on that game, right? I'm destroying relationships. My product is amazing.
If my job is to keep you so focused on this game that you don't do anything else, then I must be succeeding. If you were not sleeping with your wife anymore.
Was that the one you were thinking of, Jeff? Or
No. Okay, so one of my favorite moments from the book, and this isn't really a comedic take, but they launched World of Warcraft. It's far more popular than they expect, and people are becoming irate because they can't log on and play the game. It's a huge addicting part of their life. They're struggling with it, and one of the quips I liked is how a lot of their employees were spending just as much time at work, trying to make this happen for their players, trying to make the experience enjoyable and fix things for them. And the line I remember was something about people spending so much of their lives on this game. You could also see it reflected in a lot of the rank and file employees also spending so much of their lives on this game. And I appreciated that. You can't point your finger at them and be they're just corporate drones milking us for money. Their employees were kind of in it with the players together, trying to make it a successful experience. Now, did the employees get appropriately compensated for that? I don't know, but I enjoyed the solidarity of both from the developers and the players.
Well, didn't Morheim literally drive out to somebody's house to help troubleshoot?
Oh yeah, that was
troubleshoot issues.
I think that was basically the early days of Blizzard, before they even made Warcraft. But it was a story about how one of the games they had ported, they're running the tech support for it, and someone calls up with this issue they can't solve over the phone. It turns out he only lived half an hour away, so Mike just drove to his house and they fixed his problem.
Which is just awesome. If your CEO, if the founder of your company is going to do that, that's awesome. And you would imagine that's why the employees were willing to do that, right? It has to start at the top.
Yeah, that's something Jeff mentioned earlier, right? One thing you definitely cannot say about Morhaime is that he didn't lead by example, right? Yeah. I mean, he was always in the trenches.
Lead by doing. Adam, do you have a favorite moment?
think we've hit a lot of mine. I do just kind of want to leave it on that, and this may even be from one of the last chapters in the book, but there's this one woman who worked there for a long time, and she kind of was talking about how when she got laid off with the Microsoft acquisition, and after the lawsuit and everything, she felt such conflicting feelings because it had been such a huge part of her life, and it was all of her best memories and all of her best friends. So initially she's very, very depressed, but then she kind of comes around to, I think she describes it, or her friend described it as like, I feel like we're in a burning building and they gave me a parachute full of money and kicked me out of it. Like they're doing me like such a huge favor here.
Yeah.
Cause and the quote she uses is like, there are people in their 30s and 40s and 50s there that want to have kids, but they spend all of their time with Blizzard. And all I can ask myself is like, is Blizzard going to be there at your deathbed holding your hand? And I was just like, holy shit. Like that's heavy. Like, and I think it really does illustrate that some of these people are almost, maybe not as much anymore, but some of these people are almost like a cult-like level of devoted to the company they worked for. Cause the depressing part to me was, oh my God, they're not going to be there on your deathbed. And it's like her, of course she knew that, but I think it's like realizing that it was just a company the whole time and that, a company is just the people and the people aren't there. So why are you still there? And a good lesson for all of our listeners to learn. So.
It is important to have perspective, folks.
Well, that wraps up our first discussion on Play Nice. Stay tuned next month for part 2, where we dive into Overwatch, StarCraft, Diablo 3, and more.
You can find this episode, as well as all our previous episodes, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcasting platform.
And you can find us on all the social media at the Games Gone By podcast.
Signing off for Games Gone By, I'm Adam.
I'm Austin.
And always remember to cancel your subscription before you ruin your marriage.
Thanks for listening, guys. We'll see you next time.